All right, got it. It should be showing record right now.
Yep, it is now. It is now.
Okay, good. Okay, cool. So everybody should have access to command. Command is our center for the world in KW. So our goal here is once you've gotten access to command, I'm not going to get into teaching you how to get into command. Your tech ambassadors and the staff will be able to hook you up with that. So we're going to jump right into this as if you already have access to command. And what we're going to do is we're going to go down to our opportunities. And because today's class is on a listing, we're going to go ahead and tap our opportunity. Now, this is going to have been an opportunity that I have already created. I could have created it from this button here, and then we would go right into this is the opportunity with and usually you would probably put either the property address or the client's name here. In this case, I've called this Let's Go listing. So here we are in the opportunity. You're going to fill out all of the forms here and the questions that are stated. And this is going to help you with tracking your transaction. We're not going to focus too much on that because that's another class for tech ambassadors. So what we're going to do is we're going to jump into the documents and we're going to select a jurisdiction here on the left-hand side. And because we're in Maryland, we could be Prince George's County. In theory, we could be Montgomery County, or we could be any other county in Maryland. All right, for today's class, we're just going to use Prince George's County as an example, and that's going to select that. So that's going to be selecting the pool of documents that are accessible to you from your transactions. Next, we're going into the listing agreement. And so I like to call this first one, this first category here, because it is a listing, I like to call this is the agency set of documents. So whether you're in a buyer section or in a listing side, this is what we commonly refer to as your agency relationship with your client. So in this case, we're dealing with a seller. So it's going to be the listed side, and that's going to be that. So once you're in the opportunity, what you can do right off the bat is go here to the checklist, and you're going to see a list of all of the documents that are going to be needed for you to satisfy this listing in command. And you can go right down the list of all of these documents so that you will know what is needed in order to satisfy the listing. We're not going to go through this at this stage, but I just want to point this out that this is here for you. And we're going to refer back to this, and we're going to be talking about this in this class. But I just want to show you that's where the checklist lives. And it also lives on the welcome drive as well, if you want to just look at it there.
And if I may, Dan, real quick, we make sure, again, with our setup being a little different in our listing manager that executes all these forms, I do make sure that the rest of our agents have this specific checklist downloaded because it is important if you want to get paid. Okay. And also it is requirement, here to protect and be safe and make sure that you have all this stuff signed. But, the more actionable part of this is if you don't have these documents, your file gets turned back around in compliance. And the better prepared you are to submit it up front, the more time it saves you from chasing signatures later and being delayed on getting commissions dispersed at the end. So that's an actionable part of why this checklist in the top half is really important.
Exactly. And it's a bummer to have your file rejected by Melinda. It's frustrating. All right, so that's where the checklist lives. So now what we're going to do now, different people set this up differently. Our company supports primarily the use of zip forms and DocuSign. I happen to like using DocuSign, so that's what I'm going to be using here to demonstrate the access to this. And what I have done here is I have created an opportunity and a field here. And so if we're going to go into a listing transaction, I'm going to go ahead and select my documents in DocuSign. This is going to pull up my DocuSign account, and it's going to let's start out with the KW required forms. So when we're talking about in Maryland, what we're going to need is the KWCP affiliated business disclosure for the seller. We're going to need the KWCP home warranty disclosure for the seller. And if you're on a team and there's a possibility that you're going to be in a team in a dual agency situation in Maryland, keep in mind in Maryland, the definition of dual agency is different than it is in DC and in Virginia. So DC and Virginia have a similar definition of dual agency, which means the individual agent is in dual agency. In Maryland, the definition is a little bit different. Maryland's definition of dual agency is what designated agency is in DC and in Virginia. So it means that the company is in dual agency, and the individual agent cannot have a dual agency relationship with both the buyer and the seller. So
Hey, Dan, we had a quick question in the chat on where, could we tell folks again where to find that checklist? I guess in addition to command, you said it's the drive, the office drive. Do you have that link in the chat?
Here, let me type that into the drive. So if you go kwcapitalproperties.com/ whoops, my typing skills. Welcome. So you're going to go there, and then it's going to be in envelope 6, and then transactions.
And the whole path. See, that's service with a smile there.
Transactions, and then from there you're going to see it. I can't remember what the next.
But yeah, that's a lot. You can get. There you go, Tim.
Yeah, but you're basically, if you go in there, you'll find it. And so that should be great. You'll find it there. That's also where you can find it. Personally, I find it's just easier to go into the opportunity and click it there. But it's up to you how you want to proceed.
Thank you.
Sure. All right. All right. So dual agency within a team, if that applies. So like with Harrison and the transactions that they do on Coalition, that's entirely a possibility. If you're an individual agent just working alone, then we won't be dealing with that. And then the rest of these don't apply. So we're going to add those documents. And here they are. So next we're going to go ahead and add the Maryland required forms for the listing agreement. So we're going to go back in here again. Now we're going to go into, we are going into MR forms. And this is the way that I do it. There's a couple of different ways that you can do this. So based on the checklist that we basically saw before, you're going to go through this and want to compare all of these items to each other. So I'm going to go ahead, and I know the checklist pretty well. So we're going to go ahead and select the consent. I'm going to, just for the purpose of speeding through this more efficiently. If any of these other forms are relevant to you, then we will also use those. Exclusive right to sell. That's going to be the main document we're going to look at today. So keep in mind the difference between this form and this form here is the second one is for land, and this first one is for properties with a building on it.
So that's going to be, you're pretty much always going to use the one of improved property, exclusive right to sell residential brokerage agreement, not unimproved. That's, I mean, highly unlikely that you would do that. So
right, exactly.
And when I'm filling this, or when our team's filling this out, when I would start, Dan, I would have the checklist basically up in the screen next to me.
Yep.
And ensure that the top half of that, because that's most standard transactions, and you're not short sales, not REOs, like not other issues. So that like helps you figure out from that list you're clicking through which ones you need. So
yeah. So what he's talking about here is this section right here. So and you just go right down the list and look up each of these forms that you need right off the bat.
Cool.
Yep. All right, and I'm going to continue on down here. Just for the purpose of doing this in an efficient way. So we're going to need the notice. Consumer. Right, open house. We're going to need the open house form. We're going to need the property disclosure. And we're going to need, so this right now, keep in mind, we're just doing the listing. And I'm going to include this one here also. We're going to talk about that in a bit. All right, so typically these are the most common ones that you're going to need. And so having said that, let's start out with those. All right, before we get too far into this, I want to make sure that everybody understands that you can, regardless of whether you have a listing or not, regardless of whether you have a buyer agency or not, you have to understand that in Maryland, you cannot enter into a property and show a client, or excuse me, show a potential customer or client any property without either having signed a buyer agency agreement or having given them this form. You have to have one or the other. So if you're the listing agent and you're showing property, you're showing your listing to somebody who comes into your listing and you have not, obviously you wouldn't have had a buyer agency agreement with them because they are not going to be your client in Maryland, but you could have this form signed. I want to make, this is so important, and so many agents get this wrong. And so you've got to be able to make sure that you either, if you're walking into a property with anybody, you either have a buyer agency agreement or you have this form signed. And this form is basically disclosing to them that the agent who is showing them the property today is not their agent and is not representing them. So make sure that you have them sign this and make sure that you're indicating here that you are representing the seller and the landlord, and you will be covered for that. I want to make sure that everybody's clear on that. And if anybody has any questions, please bring those up right now, because that's a really big, important topic that I want to just head off the conversation at the moment. Anybody have any questions on this form?
And another way this would come up for you all often if you're doing an open house and someone comes in Maryland, something we would do is keep templates of this ready in DocuSign so that all you have to do is plug in someone's email to get them to sign and acknowledge. But I've also seen people put it in like a little stand-up plastic sign up front that makes them understand, and the whole intention behind it, which I think sometimes this helps Dan to, here's the form and here's what it means. It's just to make very clear who represents whom. And also that if they're not signing up with you or not signed up with somebody else, Maryland requires that you let them know they don't have active representation. That's the intention behind it. And it may take some finesse because people are going to be scared of like signing something without, knowing who you are. But the better you understand it, the better you can explain it, just the better you can communicate with consumers. And
Exactly.
Dan, what's the name of that form again at the top?
That's understanding whom the real estate agent represents.
Understanding whom the real estate agent represents.
And then, as Harrison mentioned just a minute ago, he was talking about open houses, and Maryland law says if you're going to be holding an open house at your property, your own listing, or anybody's listing for that matter, you have got to have this posted clearly and visibly. And it's got to be conspicuous. And you've got to understand that Maryland has testers that they send out. And they could very well hit you with a violation if this is not clearly visible and posted in order for everybody to see this. It would be advisable for you to post this on the front door and to have it visible on a kitchen table or a countertop somewhere inside and make it very, very clearly visible. And it has to be the law says that it has to be in this colored version. It cannot be a black and white version. Anybody have any questions on that? All right. So when we first start into this, let's go ahead and talk about consent for dual agency in Maryland. We're going to get ready to get our transaction started. So we understand we're going to have a conversation with our seller to explain to them that we as individual agents in Maryland cannot represent the seller and the buyer in the same transaction. And however, what we can do is Harrison can have a listing And I'm not going to use myself as an example here because of my role in the company, but let's say Harrison and Dr. Perkins here might have a buyer. Harrison might have the listing and Dr. Perkins might have the buyer. And in that case, we would be in a dual agency situation in Maryland because the company is in dual agency. And so it's important that we have our clients cover this. This document is also covered in another class. So I'm not going to go in great detail over it, but I just want to make sure that we understand that it's there. And we have to comply with that. And that the agent and that as we're preparing this, that our client has signed off on this in advance and made clear that they are okay with us having that with the company representing both sides of the transaction. Got anything to add on that, Harrison?
Yeah, I know in other jurisdictions, we talk about sub-agency, meaning that, you know, the primary broker, which is Keller Williams Capital Properties, is the agent, and then we're generally the sub-agent, which is where the designated agency normally comes in. Same house, but two different kind of entities within. Maryland sees it, if I'm hearing you correctly, Dan, as Keller Williams Capital Properties as the agent for both. They don't just delineate between agency and sub-agency. So in Maryland, you got to say, even though we are, you know, Dan's an agent or Dr. Perkins is an agent and I'm an agent, because we are under the same brokerage and main agency, I have to tell you up front that dual agency exists and you have to consent to that to be able to see the home, write a contract on the home, understand the nature of relationship. There's probably a longer conversation about like making people feel comfortable about that and explaining that, you know, it's not actually to their harm if you're selling a property intra company. But yeah, just know the difference. Maryland does see it different than Virginia or DC does.
So Harrison, if I have if you have a listing and your seller has not agreed to sign off on that document, and then Dr. Perkins comes to you with a buyer, and wants to show that property, what does that mean for your listing? What do you think has to happen?
I'd have to get, I guess I'd have to say to Dr. Perkins, ooh, man, that's a good question. I'd call you and be like, hey, what do I do now? I guess I'd have to get Dr. Perkins' client to sign an acknowledgement. If my clients won't, does one of the buyers at least have to acknowledge? Or
So either the listing or the buyer's agent, either the buyer or the lister, the listing, the seller would have to withdraw from an agency relationship.
Oh man.
So in Maryland, that's and this is one of the things. Maryland does some really good stuff with a lot of its laws. This is, in my opinion, this is not one of them, because this causes a chaotic situation. If your seller refuses to engage in dual agency, then what you've got is a situation where now you're and Dr. Perkins has now come up to us with a buyer. Our situation is now a position that we've got to be able to terminate our listing agreement in order for the buyer to now be brought into that picture. It's a messy, sloppy situation. So
the solution is to explain this to your seller and buyer clients in advance, how it is not a strategic disadvantage to them, because that's their fear. Like when they see dual agency, and I just had to talk about this with a client last night. I don't fight them about it, but I want to be clear that like my side, I am not sharing background information with Dr. Perkins. Keller Williams Capital Properties is a big brokerage. We have over 1,000 agents, right? So there's a high probability we will interact with somebody else in our brokerage in the field. So by you saying you don't want this, that's actually shortening or making smaller your pool of potential buyers and making smaller the pool of potential listings I can show you. Wouldn't you like to see all listings available and have all buyers available to you come in? Okay, like that's an objection handler that I'd throw out, because if they say no, it does make things unnecessarily more difficult.
Yeah. And it's cutting your nose in spite of your face. It's cutting off your nose in spite of your face. So what the point of this discussion is, if your seller doesn't want to agree to dual agency right off the bat, then it's going to cause problems later on, and you need to step back. And if you can't get them to agree to it, then you need to step back. All right.
And it's probably a thing we should write out a couple of those objections. I'm happy to talk with you. I mean, I guess we're recording this, they can be sent around, but like keep those objection handlers in mind. And
Yeah.
it's to their benefit, not to their detriment. Like they'd be afraid, they have the fear, right? That it's going to harm them or you're trying to harm them, but you got to establish that trust and say, I want to help you and have as many opportunities available to you as possible.
Absolutely. And we've got David Bediz here, just joined us. So he's here to help us out today as well. And David, why don't you introduce yourself, David, and tell everybody who you are, what you are, everything else.
Good morning. How is everyone? Sorry I was a little late. I was on the other KWCP meeting site, not the KWCP DC meeting site. So I apologize for that. I was like, where is everybody? I'm a team owner, Bediz Group LLC, if you've heard of it, in the DuPont Circle office. Been an agent for 17 years, since 2004. And last year we did a little bit less than 100 million in sales. I can't say that we're nearly as productive as Harrison's team. My goodness, they're on fire. So good for you, Harrison. They're doing great. But I'm here to lend my opinion and some experience as well, however I can. So feel free to ask me any questions too.
Great. And both of you guys just jump in anytime you have anything to add, and we'll go through this. And as well, if anybody any of the agents watching, participants here, feel free to jump in with your questions as we go through this. All right, so today we're talking about the exclusive right to sell the residential brokerage agreement in Maryland. So obviously this is a Maryland Realtors document. We can use this in any county in Maryland, any jurisdiction in Maryland. And that's the only place where it applies. I know David uses it out on the Eastern Shore as well, and because he does a lot of stuff back there too. So this document applies. All right, so we're going to, obviously, if we're going to fill out the form, it's important to really fill out all of the fields as they're stipulated here. So just go ahead and fill out all of the fields with your seller's agent, with your seller's mailing address and your phone numbers and your contact information. The law requires us as a brokerage and as listing agents to fill out all of the contact information here in paragraph 2. Our brokerage is Keller Williams Capital Properties. We're not Keller Williams. We're not Keller Williams Realty. We're not any other variation.
We are Capital with an A, Mr. Bouchard.
Oh, you are correct.
Sorry, I don't want to call you out, but I just
I don't even know how. Yeah, it is with an A, not an O.
Yeah,
absolutely. You are correct there. Thank you for that. All right, so we're not, any other variation of that is not correct. And why is that important, guys?
Identifying the principal is important. I would say in the event of a lawsuit, but if you don't identify the principals in any transaction and then in a contract, you may not have standing. So if we ever had to sue a seller for violating this contract and we didn't put the right brokerage name in there, it may be considered an invalid contract. And that goes for your contracts too, of course.
So if I went ahead and I put something like Keller Williams Realty, and I had my seller sign this listing agreement, and we had a transaction with an agent from Keller Williams Realty, from a real Keller Williams Realty franchise, or something, any other name, whatever, you pick your name as you wish, and we had a dispute. Wouldn't that cause some confusion in the mind of the clients? Absolutely. So, and if we did put something like that was not our actual brokerage name, then we would actually probably be subject to a potential charge if there were ever a dispute or if there were a grievance brought up against us. It's not likely, but it is a potential grievance. So we really need to make sure that the name of the brokerage is correct. Keller Williams Capital with an A. All right. And we've got the brokerage address. Now, for me and for a lot of us on this call, it's 519 C Street. If you're from another market center, then you'll obviously put wherever your license is hung. And make sure that you, and this is not even correct here either. So 37700. So make sure that you put the actual brokerage phone number there so that it can reach the broker of record, and then you can put your own cell phone number down below. You actually should. That would be mine. Fill out your email address and contact information there. It's critically important that they've got the right phone number for your office, for your market center office, and so that they can reach a broker if they need to reach a broker. And we know that that never happens, right, David and Harrison?
Never.
Never.
All right, so
We gotta keep you busy somehow, Dan.
exactly. All right, property listing. All right, so Keller Williams Capital Properties is the broker, is hereby authorized by the undersigned sellers or by the representatives of the sellers to sell as exclusive real estate broker the property known as 123 Main Street, and it will be conveyed in fee simple and or subject to annual ground rent. So the annual ground rent is not something that we run into a lot. There are some areas of Baltimore that have some ground rent. Anything out on the Eastern Shore, David, that has ground rent?
Well, in Delaware, yeah, there's a bunch of places that have ground rent. It's
Okay.
usually pretty
There's
cheap.
mobile home parks. There's,
Yeah.
I think,
Yeah,
one in
that
PG
too.
County, like somewhere,
Mhm.
like Clinton. There's an actual one with ground rent.
Right, exactly. There's a few, but not 90%, 95% of the time, you're going to find that it's going to be in fee simple. And how about our agents on the call today? Anybody who can tell me what distinguishes fee simple versus a ground rent? What does fee simple mean in that situation like that? Any of our other agents? Come on, we have to have some participation here. Come on, somebody.
Actually, I'm curious to know the difference because it's the first time I've heard the term ground rent. So
Okay, well, good. Well, glad. Thank you for saying that, Timothy. Appreciate that.
And
So,
Mitchell was in the chat and said owned, free and clear, which is a good guess, but not quite right.
yeah.
Uh,
So what is it? What's the answer, Harrison?
I explained fee simple as you own the actual structure, and then there is a separate tax ID and ownership of the dirt beneath the structure as well. So when you own a property fee simple, it's a type of ownership that is for single family homes. There can be another homeowners association on top of fee simple, but there is not a separate condo association. Well, actually, excuse me, structure and dirt. That's how I describe fee simple ownership. You own the structure and you own the dirt.
Right. You own the property, the land, the earth below you, and the sky above you. So sometimes, if you remember back in your pre-licensing classes, you talked about air rights and mineral rights, and so all of that encompasses what fee simple is. You own the earth, the land, the house, the earth below you, and the sky above you.
And to clarify, I mean, you still can have a mortgage on this property. When we say own, it doesn't mean you own it free and clear. You could still have liens, mortgages, encumbrances, but when you actually do pay it off, you own the earth, the air above you, and the structure itself too.
Right. And you can, in theory, you can sell off some of those rights as well. You could sell mineral rights, you could sell air rights.
Right.
We have a couple of buildings in downtown DC where some old historic buildings sold their air rights to a developer who built a building next door and then built their buildings over the top of a historic building. And usually that happens like churches and things like that. So
Becomes
that's,
very complicated when you try to get lending on that. There's one downtown that's a co-op that's built in the air rights of a commercial condo below it. It's kind of ridiculous. It's whoever thought of that
yeah,
was really getting ambitious.
yeah, it's really creative and really lawyerly.
Yeah, there's a lot of
If we're getting
paperwork
into that,
involved.
we need lawyers to walk us through that. All right, the listing terms. We've got to be able to put some clear-cut terms in here. So we've got a start date and an end date to the listing. So you're in Maryland, it is possible to sign the listing agreement and have it be effective at a later date. And then so it would start on a later date and then end on a much later date. But we've got to have those two dates in there, exactly where it starts and where it ends. So we can't put 6 months. We can't put, we can't put the word 6 months. We can't put, until terminated. It's got to be a finite, specific date. Anybody have questions about that?
Reverend Dion asked, are there any tax write-offs associated with the ground lease?
Talk to your CPA. Yeah, we don't, that's beyond our pay grade, and we need to be referring that to our tax specialist for that. But
I have a question about the effective date.
okay,
How far off can it be if you say it could be delayed?
10 years. There's no rule. There's no requirement.
There's no real advantage in delaying it. You want to try to have it as effective as soon as possible, because literally tomorrow somebody could knock on the door and say, I want to buy your house. And then if they say that, and meanwhile the listing effective date isn't for another 2 weeks, you're out. You're not going to get paid.
I understand that. I was just asking for legal purposes.
Yeah, and I think Mitchell was probably talking more so on the expiration date. I mean, in theory, you could put something, 10 years from now if you really wanted to. I don't think that there's much of a point in that, but there is no requirement that it has to be any particular period of time.
I think that that's most useful when somebody is approaching you that's already in a listing agreement, and they're saying, look, my current listing agent, he's not great, but he's not a bad guy. I'm not going to cancel his agreement with him. It expires in 3 days or 2 weeks or whatever. I'll let it ride out for that period of time, but I want to sign with you afterwards if we don't sell it. And so that would be a good time where you could put it being effective the day that the other listing agreement expires. That's probably the best use of it. Great point.
Yeah, and so guys, Harrison, David, if you're approached with a seller who says, you know what, I've got this listing agreement with this agent and they're just not doing the job. I don't want to work with them anymore. I want to work with you instead. What's our response here when somebody says that? No, I have not. Can we tell him or her how he should be proceeding to terminate that listing agreement with the previous seller, with the previous listing agent? Can we be coaching him? Can we be advising him? Can we be telling him anything about how to do that?
Technically, the Code of Ethics prohibits you from influencing a seller to do that.
Exactly. That's the standard that we have to go by right there. We cannot be guiding them or coaching them on how to terminate their listing. So, but
to Harrison's point, importantly, if you do see the listing agreement and it either has parts of it that are not filled in correctly, like there's no listing price or end date, it's not signed by the broker, it's not signed by the agent.
Right.
There are ways, if you see that, then they don't have a listing agreement, in which case you can coach them on telling them you don't have a listing agreement that's valid, and that essentially that would alleviate your responsibility or help you.
So that brings up a good point. Are we attorneys though? So the question is, so we now have asked the seller and we've said, can I see your listing agreement? The seller shows you the listing agreement. And for all intents and purposes, it looks to you that it isn't a fully ratified binding listing agreement. It's not, and it looks to you to be not complete, and it looks to you to not be valid. Technically, we are not attorneys, so we don't have the ability to actually make a legal judgment call like that. So now I might go ahead and I might point out the fact, gee, I see here that the listing broker hasn't signed your listing agreement. That's one example. And if the listing broker has not signed the listing agreement, is that a valid listing?
No, it's not relevant.
That's correct. It is not. So you must have, and this is why it's incredibly important. It's incredibly important that compliance rules state that you must, if you're going to have your client sign a listing agreement, you've got to make sure that that file is delivered to compliance within 2 days so that Melinda can go ahead and put Brandon Green's signature on it. If Brandon Green's signature does not appear on your listing agreement, do you have a listing?
No. And Brandon Green is the principal broker of record for KW Capital Properties. That's why that's important.
And don't forget, it has to be returned back to the seller or even the buyer. This is the same rule for buyer agency agreements too. You do not have any control or any standing if your buyer wants to work with another agent if you've not returned a signed buyer agency agreement signed by the broker back to them.
That's exactly
And
correct.
Same goes to the,
and that's
same goes to
called
the listing
delivery.
agreement.
And that's
Yeah.
called delivery. And delivery is just as much an important fact as the execution of the documents. So great point, guys. Appreciate that. All right, as required under section 17-534B5. So what's that? What is that all about? What is this? That looks to me like that's a reference to a law. Might that be a reference to the law? So whenever we see references to laws here in all of our documents, I don't care what document you're looking at, if you see a reference to a law, it's there for a reason. It's there as a reference that you can, and the clients can, go and Google that particular section 17-534B5 in the Maryland Real Estate Brokers Act and find out what the governing law is that dictates the terms of that. So don't be afraid of those references. Utilize and read those and make sure that you understand what we're talking about and understand what the purpose is for the referencing in the law. So there are some provisions that are offered in that law, and the parties agreed to the following provisions for termination of this agreement. In Maryland, so in some different jurisdictions, there are ways to terminate an agency relationship. The law in Maryland specifically says that an agency relationship may be terminated in Maryland by any unilateral notice in writing. So that doesn't mean, so that essentially means if a seller decides that they don't want to work with you, orally telling you that they don't want to work with you is not sufficient. Sending you an email is not sufficient. In writing means a statement in writing and signed. If they say, I don't want to work with you anymore in Maryland, that's the way it is. That's the rule. So in DC, it does not require a unilateral, it requires a mutual agreement. So keep that in mind also. So what does that mean? That effectively, what does a unilateral termination of an agency agreement mean for listing agents, guys? What do you think that means? What are the implications of that?
That the seller can send you a written notice of cancellation, and that's it. That it's one way, unilateral.
At any time. And that is effectively how the termination of the agency agreement is. So the seller,
there's one key provision though that we need to make sure everyone understands. The law says that it must include a provision for the seller to cancel the agreement unilaterally, but it also says subject to terms agreed upon in the listing agreement. And that's why this paragraph is here. And also you'll notice in the GCAR listing agreement, there are specific terms as to how it can be canceled, including, very importantly, the time frame. And here is where you can indicate the time frame that a unilateral cancellation is to be allowed. And this is my favorite part of the contract or the listing agreement. It's where you can actually, frankly, protect yourself better than the law does. The law does not protect us very well, because essentially, if you just read the law and just said at any time, the seller could just cancel on you right before you're about to get a full price contract and you're about to earn your commission, and that's not fair. So I would say that for anyone signing this listing agreement with a client, you need to provide a little bit of extra protection for yourself. And the way I do it, frankly, because I don't like this law, is to say that it's at least a 30 days notice. And that way you have a month to figure out why it is your seller is canceling on you. Also, you have a month to get a contract in the door that might allow you to continue the listing agreement and go to settlement. And then it also just provides kind of a buffer so that if your seller is just really mad at you for one reason or another, of course, especially if it's not your fault, then it gives a little bit of time for them to simmer down and figure out what it is that's wrong so that you can fix it. So you do have some protection under the law. I think that was negotiated well.
Yep.
So that the seller can cancel unilaterally, but subject to provisions that you agree to mutually in this agreement. And that's why you should put at least some period of time as advance notice before it could be actually effectively canceled.
Very true. Very great point, David. Appreciate that. All right. An expiration of termination of this agreement by the seller or the broker shall be subject to the provisions of paragraph 14 of this agreement, and paragraph 14 of this agreement shall survive the expiration or termination of this agreement. Notwithstanding the rights of the parties to terminate this agreement as provided herein, the broker, in the broker's sole and absolute discretion, may terminate this agreement at any time and effective immediately in the event the seller provides any false information. So if our seller, if you knowingly take a listing and you know that there is XYZ defect in the property, particularly if it's a latent defect, and yet the seller is not choosing not to disclose that to a buyer who probably has a right to know that, then it is not only do we have the right to terminate the agreement because of the seller's wish to not disclose that, we actually have the obligation to terminate the agreement for that reason. We can't be in business with people who are intending to lie and who are intending to falsify information, because if that comes back and somebody finds out about that later on and there's a lawsuit or some kind of grievance against us, then we as the listing agent, if we participated in hiding that material fact, then we could be liable for that. So we'd want to avoid that as any possibility. You guys have any thoughts on that? All right. So all right, so that's just an example of that. So the listing price of the property is a specific dollar amount. We can't put TBD TBD. If you put to be determined or anything like that, anything other than a specific dollar amount, Melinda's going to kick it back at you and require something to be written in there. And by the way, Melinda is our compliance officer in the company. So whenever I keep referring to Melinda, she's the one who reviews all of our documents and specifically goes and checks for certain things to make sure that they're in compliance with the law and requirements. All right, stop me if you have any questions, anybody. We have a silent group of agents in here today, don't we? All right, so paragraph 6, the showing instructions. If there are any special showing instructions that our seller wants to make sure that we abide by, this is an opportunity for that to be stipulated so that we follow those directions to the letter of whatever they have directed. You know, sometimes we use this when there are tenants involved, and we might go ahead and say that, all right, you need to have confirmation from the tenant to show the property. Or something like that, or if there's any special considerations for a pet, a dog or something that might be on the property, this is something that the seller might need to have like a 2-hour advance notice so they can put the dog away, other things like that. All right. Moving along to paragraph 7. Broker is authorized to and shall market the property, including but not limited to entering the property into the applicable multiple listing service, installing a sign, photographing the property, and installing a lockbox. Seller acknowledges that the broker is bound by bylaws, policies, and procedures and rules and regulations governing the MLS and the lockbox system owner. The broker is hereby granted the right to report to the MLS for dissemination in accordance with the MLS rules and policies any contract of sale and sales price, including other items upon any sale of the property is made. So let's kind of look over that. The broker is hereby granted the right to report to the MLS. So that tells us that we've got to be able to report that to Bright MLS whenever that we've got a contract under sale, and then whenever it sells, it goes to settlement. So except as otherwise provided for in paragraphs B, C, D, and E below, and in the accordance with the directions therein, the broker, upon election by broker and in broker's sole and absolute discretion, is hereby authorized by the seller to submit and market the property, including the street name and house number, to the broker's website, to internet websites of licensed real estate salespersons and brokerages, so that, if there's a Keller Williams brokerage, or if there's a Coldwell Banker or a Remax or Long and Foster, this is the seller is giving us permission to disseminate that information to the other brokerages via MLS, any other internet website in accordance with MLS rules. So there are lots of other websites that also republish that information. Print media, or any other available MLS programs. So that might be something like Remine, which is an MLS, a Bright partner. So programs like Remine and other similar type of programs report their properties into those other systems. So that allows us participation in that. All right, display the aggregated MLS active listing information on participants' public websites with the MLS rules and regulations, and allow other MLS participants and authorized users to market the property. All right, if the property is scheduled for an open house by a broker, seller authorizes the broker to advertise the property as an open house. So keep in mind, when we've got an open house and we're advertising the property as an open house, do we have the ability to limit who can and can't come into the property? Right? Yeah, it's exactly right. So I had a client one time who had that I listed her property for sale, and she had her ex-husband that she was fearful and really had great anxiety about having him come back in and look at the property because it was now listed for sale. And so it was a very uncomfortable situation for this seller, and she had to decide whether or not she actually really wanted a public open house or not. So it was a conversation that she and I had to have, and I had to dive into where her concerns were in order to address her concerns. Is it because she feared that he would take some of her personal property in the course of the event, in the course of the open house. If I happened to be in another room and I didn't see what he was doing, if he was going to take something, if that was a concern, then we had to address that issue. If it was a concern of her, so exploring what the seller's needs are and having them come to the conclusion to decide, yes, I still want an open house, or no, I don't, because I cannot exclude anybody from attending this open house. This has got to be a public open house. And when public, that means anybody can walk in. So now we can meter and limit the number of people that are walking in at any one time, but we can't make any judgments and decisions about you can come in but yet you cannot.
And if I may, Dan, I think that's definitely important 2021 moving forward with all the sensitivity and tension around between racism and people picking different things, especially in different neighborhoods. So my advice with this now, and we have a new opportunity presented by COVID to set a requirement that I do in all of my opens for contact tracing. And I say, look, if you're coming in the house, you're going to be in a space with me. I'm asking that you give me a name, phone number, and email. I'm not going to bug you otherwise, but I need to do that to know if someone tells me they're sick or someone was in here sick later, I will. And I think if you set consistent information collection standards from everybody and utilize tools like Open Home Pro or a sign-in sheet, that extra level of just making people identify themselves can help, but you have to be consistent with it for everybody. Like you can't say, well, I need your information and I don't need yours. Like consistency is key in all these, and you got to explain to your seller that if we're opening up to the public, like I can set a basic requirement of information collection from people, but I can't exclude any potential person. And I honestly don't want to, because you never know what one specific person, who they know, who they might talk about, who they might share it with, that might actually sell your home. So it's like both the right thing to do and a smart, business strategy to not exclude people and just be consistent with what you do.
Exactly. So let's see here. I'm noticing a couple texts. Let's see. I've witnessed realtors deter folks from touring homes because of budgets. Just to be clear, that's unacceptable. Weisling, what do you mean by that?
I think like showing stuff out of their price range, you mean? Like asking to go see things out of their price range with you?
No, like walking into an open house and the realtor telling you like, because of your price range, I wouldn't even bother looking at this home.
That's not a protected class. Somebody's budget does not preclude you from discouraging them from seeing a property.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, but if you're holding an open house, how are you? And somebody comes to your open house.
How do you know their budget?
Yeah, exactly. How do you know what their budget is? And
I could just be like attending some really wonky open houses, but they normally ask like, what's your price range? What's your budget at the open house? And then from there,
I would say that's a bad sales strategy. If you're trying to land a buyer, if you're trying to create a relationship with people, you should be talking to them about yes, not no.
Yeah.
So if you're holding an open house, you should be trying to find solutions for them and arranging a private meeting with them as soon as possible, perhaps even after the open house, and not saying, "Oh no, you can't afford that." That's not a good sales strategy.
Yeah, it's not a good sales strategy, and it could very well be a fair housing violation. If you're coming in and making a judgment, on either based on what somebody says, and then discouraging them from being able to see the property. There could be some, especially in DC, there were rules about that. And so, if you never know I make a very good story about this. Years ago, I had a friend who didn't have a penny to his own name. And I had a great relationship with this friend. And in my mind, I knew that he was never, ever going to ever amount to being able to buy his own property or sell his own property or being any substantial. In my mind, I figured him to be not a potential business client. But I gave him some attention when he approached me, not knowing that he was in a relationship with somebody who was very, very well qualified. And because I gave him some attention in the process of discussing real estate, I got one of the most profitable referrals of business because I simply gave him the attention and I didn't turn him away based on my own perception of what I thought he was capable of. So you just never know who you run into, who is going to turn into the most valuable referral. So just because this person says that I don't qualify for X doesn't mean that my partner doesn't, or my spouse doesn't, or doesn't mean that I know somebody who will. And you should, and like David said, it's better business practice to be inclusionary and to find ways to bring people to a yes than to automatically shut the door in their face.
And one other thing too, similar to that, is I find that every single buyer I work with gives me a price range that they've determined for themselves that's actually significantly less than what they can afford and what they even would be comfortable paying. A lot of people don't know how to calculate a monthly payment based on a sale price. So they just kind of, so a lot of buyers will walk in to a first meeting with me and have a number in their head of what they want to spend as a maximum that they've literally plucked out of thin air. Like there's no basis for that determination of them. We have one buyer, literally, their earnings, household earnings, are over $25,000 a month, and they told me they wanted to stay under $700,000. $700,000, the mortgage payment on that with a 20% down payment is around $2,500 a month. They could afford almost 5 times that. They could afford almost a $3 million mortgage with that kind of income. So rather than telling people, oh, well, then based on what you told me, you shouldn't look there, you should be asking probing questions like, well, have you talked to a lender about your finances yet? Or asking them even more detailed questions like, what kind of monthly payment would you be comfortable paying? What is your current rent? What are you paying in rent right now? Or what is your current mortgage if you already own? These kind of questions are better than automatically closing the door based on even things that they say to you. So all of this is, the important thing though, is to get another appointment. Every phone call with a potential client or a lead, the goal of that phone call is to get an appointment. Every meeting with a lead, even at an open house, the goal is to get another appointment. So work on that without saying no, without saying you can't, without saying you won't. Talk about things they can do, talk about things you will do, rather than things they can't see or can't afford.
Exactly. Work towards the yes. Don't work towards the no. All right. Now, paragraph B, seller may elect not to have the property listed and listing displayed in the MLS at all. Seller to initial if seller does not authorize the broker to display the property in the MLS listing. What do we commonly call that situation, guys?
Off market.
Pocket.
Yeah, it's an office exclusive. An office exclusive. So keep in mind, if you're going to be doing office exclusives, there are strict rules about what you may and may not do with respect to an office exclusive. You need to talk to your lead broker out of your office if you've got any questions or doubts about that, because this is some dangerous territory. And if you are in violation of the rules, the Bright MLS rules, then you could be held liable to that and subject to that. And the company does not support violations to the office exclusive policies of Bright MLS. All right, the broker may not submit and market the property by and through display on the MLS. So that would, we typically would hopefully avoid that if possible. Generally speaking, it's to our sellers' best interest to be able to have as broad of a broad exposure to the entire MLS, so that they get a wide and competitive offering of their listing, so that they can maximize their sale price in the end. Seller hereby acknowledges that having selected not to display the property listing in the MLS at all, the real estate licensees from other companies and their buyer clients who have access to the MLS may not be aware that the seller's property is for sale and the terms and conditions under which seller is marketing the property. Also, the seller's property will not be included in the MLS download to various real estate internet sites that are used by the public to search for property listings, and any reduction of the exposure of the property may lower the number of offers made, negatively impact the sale price. So generally speaking, we typically assume that the more buyers that we bring to our listing, the better. The better environment we can create for a competitive offer situation is going to give our sellers a higher sale price. And so that's going to be where that's going to be the ideal environment. Felicia, did you raise your hand?
Yes, I did. Going to your question, to your remarks regarding the exclusive office listings, does that include pocket listings? Because I know pocket listings is an issue in the state of Maryland.
So what are you referring to when you're saying pocket listings?
Basically, the property is got the listing agreement with the property owner, but we are not putting it on the MLS.
So that's exactly the same situation.
So it's the same thing, right?
Yeah, office exclusive pocket listing in that situation is the same thing.
Okay.
So there are strict rules. If you're going to use an office exclusive environment, you can market it to other KWCP agents, but you cannot market it in any other way whatsoever. Okay? You can send an email blast to
Any other public way, right, Dan? In any other public way in a form
You
that
can to your clients though too.
Yeah,
And the clients of KWCP agents.
that's correct.
So closed communication, meaning an email thread with just one to one, one to many, but not one to something that could be like public and then shared otherwise out of your control, right?
Correct. So I ran into a violation just a week ago where an agent from another company, I won't mention the name, sent an email blast, office exclusive listing not entered in the MLS, and yet here I am receiving it from a totally different company. That's a violation of the policy. So I should not have received that listing. It was a beautiful listing, and it would have been a great sale, and I appreciate having received it. But the reality is it was a violation of the policy because it was sent to me in a different brokerage.
Why would someone elect to do that? What are some reasons for not wanting to list on MLS?
Well, in our area, in the DC area, we have a lot of high-level politicians. We have a lot of people who have, for reasons, that there are their own reasons. The reason the policy was created was to protect the privacy of significant people who would need to have protection and want to be discreet about their selling their property.
Let's be honest though. I want to be real with people, Dan, because I've been fighting this since the policy came out. this is a policy that in general only benefits the brokerages that have these pocket listings. It was originally posed as a solution to exactly the problem that it is now creating and fostering. It was trying to prevent brokerages from having their own, basically their own private MLS of listings, their own private book of listings. So for example, one brokerage, I won't name, deals in very high-end listings. Many of their listings, they would never list in the MLS at all. They would people traipsing through your house. You want to be able to try out a higher price without having to do any of the work. And then later, if we don't sell it that way, then we can put it in the MLS. That's how they're selling it to their sellers. And those may be advantages, but honestly, the best advantage to a seller, we all know, is to have your property listed in the open market with access to all the buyers out there, not just the buyers from within one brokerage. So and this is a very important point, when you go to a listing appointment, I start out telling people during the listing appointment, I say, you may be interviewing other agents that might be trying to sell you on a private exclusive or a extended coming soon period, or trying out a higher price, but only within brokerage agents within our brokerage. And that is purely there to serve the needs and interests of the brokerage and that agent, and not you. They are trying to sell it within their own brokerage. They are not trying to get you the highest price. So if you hear that, run away. And I tell them that, and that way they know that they're going to get some snazzy, slick sales pitch about why private exclusives are right for them. They'll immediately realize that they're being sold a crock of shit, and to put it bluntly. It's not in their best interest. That's my not so subtle.
How you really feel, David? Hold back.
Yeah, right.
So in general, I agree wholeheartedly with David. We definitely want to be careful about how we articulate the behaviors and the motivations of other brokerages, and so we don't want to be, we've got to watch that delicate line, even if we're not specifically identifying an XYZ brokerage. We've got to make sure that, or XYZ agent, that we are not constructing our conversations in a way that will disparage them. But the reality to what David is saying is absolutely true. I think that the concept and the purpose for what the listing, for the office exclusive listing was designed for is currently being abused and capitalized negatively by a certain niche within the real estate industry that is up to a greater detriment to our clients than it really should be. And we should be avoiding the office exclusive situation as much as possible. But having said that, we understand that it is a factor of our business. It is a factor of the nature of our business today. It is current policy, and so we've got to live with it and move with it. But let's just make sure that we don't hold ourselves in violation of the rules that do apply. All right, let's move on. So let's move on to paragraph C. Seller may elect not to have the property listing or the property address displayed on the internet, and there may be some reasons for that. There may be some, so that's not to say that they are not going to put it in the MLS. That just says that they don't want to put it into the internet on on various other websites that are public facing. And there may be some reasons for that if our person is a major political figure or other celebrity of some sort, that may be a factor there. So generally speaking, it would be better to include the property in all of our advertising and marketing. But if not, then that's a lesser issue than.
But I mean, just to be clear though, it's impossible to list it in the MLS without it being on the internet. So there are some things here where logically you can't choose one and then also choose the other or not choose the other.
That's
So
true.
just read it carefully, and obviously it's in the client's best interest to have the property listed fully with photographs with the address. There are two blanks there at the bottom though, where we do sometimes choose to remove the authorization, and that is authorizing the use of or the display of unedited comments or reviews. I usually have them sign that because while I can't control what other websites do, if other websites are following MLS guidelines like Redfin or Zillow, for example, which usually do, we do want to have unedited comments prohibited, because you just never know what somebody will write, and I'd rather have nothing at all written than have something negative written. And then with regard to valuation, this is actually a strategic decision you guys have to make. I always look up the Redfin and Zillow, Trulia, whatever estimates online before I go to a listing appointment. That's partially because I like to check my own work, see what they're saying. They're often very wildly off from each other, and I just want to see what the public will end up seeing for an estimation of value for a listing I have, so that I know whether the public will come into an open house thinking it's overpriced or not from the beginning. And oftentimes the Redfin value is quite a bit higher than what I think it ought to be listed for and what the seller agrees it ought to be listed for. And in that case, I want that valuation to be public, because then everyone walking into the open house will think that this is a value, it's a bargain. And if it's way lower than what we are listed at, then certainly I want to have that valuation turned off. And they do follow this policy, so you should do your homework agreement so that you know that below a certain point, you'll want to have to turn off the ability for Redfin or Zillow to post their automated valuations.
All right, good points, good points. You have anything to add there, Harrison?
No, just it is best to have them exposed to all. If people say they don't want either the public comments or the public valuation, that's just a more intense process. It's probably a different class we need to have on how, and David, you teach me how you actually stop the third-party sites from allowing it. I don't know. I just encourage people to let it out, but also we don't deal in super high-end stuff, and it's best for the majority of our properties to be exposed to everybody. So I think it'd be a small subset of the listings you would encounter where those details would actually harm the client, as opposed to just having it seen where all consumers are, which is, Redfin, Zillow, and third-party sites. But I'd be curious to know at a later convo how you stop the public comments and how you stop the public valuation, because I don't know.
No, it's in the listing. When you input the listing into a matrix, there are questions there that allow you to say, are public comments allowed, are public valuations allowed? And if you say no, then anyone who's following MLS guidelines, and Redfin does follow those guidelines, will turn off their valuation and will turn off comments. And
that just gives you fuel, if they're not, to take action against them, right? If you requested it and they don't.
Look, we're not going that far. We're just hoping that people follow the guidelines. I obviously cannot prevent people from making comments online about anything. So this is just a measure, a small measure to try to control the situation. But obviously we don't have complete control.
Totally get it. Yep, that's all. I was just not disagreeing, just saying I didn't know how.
Yeah. All right, sounds good. Thank you very much, guys. All right, coming soon listings. The coming soon listing status is an option for properties listed in the MLS that are not available but will be soon. Sellers who choose this option must have executed a listing agreement. Listings under the coming soon status are given an MLS number. All MLS subscribers may view the listings under the status. However, properties listed under the coming soon status may not be shown and are not syndicated to public real estate websites. If seller selects this status, the listing agent must enter an expected on-market date in the MLS that can be no later than 21 days from when the listing was submitted to the MLS. The coming soon status will automatically update to active on the expected on-market date if not made active sooner. So if we're going to be honoring the letter and intent of the rule here, then it may not be shown. The property may not be shown by ourselves or to any other owners, any other prospective buyers, or to any other buyer agents. So we should not be letting, we as agents cannot be party to letting the property be shown to other buyers or agents showing the property. It cannot be shown, period. That's the point of the sentence. It cannot be shown. So if it's incoming soon status, we can't let it be shown. End of statement. Anybody have questions on that?
The only thing to point out, Dan, is that you can, if someone sends you an offer, you can present an offer, like especially in hyper-competitive markets. I think it's important to be clear. You can present offers on coming soon property sight unseen. And if a seller decides to accept them, that's permissible, but you're not supposed to allow showings in coming soon status.
Right. And if you do receive an offer like that, sometimes you'll receive an offer and it will come in and they will say, you know, all right, you'll get the offer and as in a coming soon status, and it'll say, but buyer will have the right to view the property, you know, within 24 hours or 48 hours. If you're going to do that, then you must remove it out of the coming soon status and put it into the active under contract status immediately prior to allowing that buyer to go view the property. So there are some circumstances where it may very well be in a coming soon status, and it may quickly turn into an active under contract, and it may skip the active status in the MLS, right? So it's entirely plausible, and it doesn't necessarily mean that something shady is going on. It could simply mean that somebody has written a sight unseen offer and submitted it with a condition that it be later viewed. So if you're going to go ahead and accept an offer like that, you must turn it into an active status before allowing that buyer to see the property.
Okay, so if you have a property that hasn't made market yet, the coming soon status has not been, you know, hasn't been put on MLS, but yet you have people that just walk up to the homeowner and say, you know, I want to submit an offer. That wouldn't require.
Well, how are the people knowing that the property is being is going to be available soon?
So for instance, across the street from me is a house being renovated.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to be a flip, I believe. And so if someone just decides to go to that homeowner and say, hey, you know,
that's not regulated at all. That's totally okay. The only regulations occur when you start marketing the property. If you have a sign out front as a realtor,
okay.
not just a real estate agent or developer, but as a realtor, we have to abide by this new rule. If you put a sign out front that says coming soon, it has to go into the MLS under coming soon status within, I think, 24. It's by the next business day. That's the rule. Okay. So, and that goes for putting it on Facebook, sending out an email blast, anything like that. But that's only realtors. So developers sometimes will put a sign out front and they'll leave it there for 6 months. So, you know, there's a lot of different kind of nuances to this.
Yeah, we can't.
But what you just said was okay. They can go directly to the homeowner. They can go to the builder, whoever.
Okay.
No
we
problem.
can't control what our clients do.
Yeah.
You know, but we can control what we do. And that's where.
And by the way, a little trick that we found: if you really want to have a period of time where you're able to get people in this coming soon status situation. I don't recommend it 100% because we've actually had another problem I can identify in a minute, but if you start marketing, put a sign out front and then send out email blasts and Facebook and social media, Instagram, all that stuff on a Friday, you will get the entire weekend, Friday afternoon, Saturday, Sunday, Monday until basically midnight before you have to list it in the MLS as coming soon, which then prevents you from showing it to anybody. So you could literally have an entire weekend of showings that are entirely outside of the MLS if you wanted to, and still follow the rules. The problem with that is, again, it's the same thing I mentioned earlier. Do you want your seller to get the benefit of having all the buyers in the marketplace to see it? Or do you want the seller to only have buyers that find it through your marketing efforts see it? And the MLS is by far the most powerful marketing tool that all of us have. It's like a tidal wave versus a trickle when it comes to how many buyers will see your property once it's listed versus how you advertising it on Facebook and that sort of thing. So it's really not doing your seller a service if you're doing this kind of pre-market showing and like private showings available this weekend only, that sort of thing. That might help you. That might allow you to find your own buyer, but it's not really helping the seller. But if for any reason you want to have like a little pre-market introduction to a listing, you can start marketing on a Friday as long as you have it in the MLS by Monday afternoon or evening as coming soon. You're allowed to show it over that weekend.
You okay over there, Dick? Everything good?
Yeah, they're just cooking brunch and burning the kitchen down. Sorry.
All righty. Okay, so that's the coming soon. All right, consent to discuss other properties with buyers and sellers at open house. So seller authorizes or does not authorize the broker to discuss other properties with buyers at seller's open house. So this is a question that will come up and is probably likely to happen if you're going to hold an open house. So it basically is a scenario where you're either going to have to, if a question comes up about other properties, you're either going to have to say, sorry, I can't discuss that right now, but I'd be happy to meet you later. Or you are authorized to have that discussion right then and there. So this is a matter of being loyal and having all of the attention going to your client's property, or whether or not the seller is allowing you the latitude to have that kind of conversation to talk about other properties. Guys, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think it's helpful to have that permission, because the intention here is to make sure that you're not speaking disparagingly about your listing or the listing you're showing and doing an open house for, which you should never do, right? Good sales is not about always juxtaposing negative to positive where it is, but I've found this helpful to be able to compare what you're with and frame it in sales language in a positive light. So, having this checked and allowing you to talk about what's going on nearby, which matters a lot, is important. And if you don't, then it is really hard to compare and just talk about the house. So I think it's helpful to have a check.
Right. I agree. Broker's responsibility to market the property is suspended upon the seller's acceptance of a written offer to purchase the property unless otherwise agreed by the broker. All right. Grant and release of property data to the broker. Seller grants to the broker the unlimited right to use, publish, disseminate, sell, and license to others all text, graphics, photos, virtual tours, documents, and any other types of data entered into the MLS. The seller hereby releases to the broker all of the seller's interests in all intellectual property and rights therein. So we know that a lawyer didn't write that sentence. Yeah. So the seller is basically giving us the right to market and promote all of the properties. Now, and all of the pictures in the home. So keep in mind, we've got to be sensitive to the fact that The sellers may very well have some decorations or home furnishings that could be sensitive to their own interests. Things like children's names on walls, and references to the bedrooms for a child's name, which may very well probably should be considered. We should probably consider eliminating things like that. So in order to not have that come back and haunt us later on for nefarious reasons. But we've got to be particularly careful if we're going to eliminate things for other reasons. If we're going to be guiding or advising our clients to eliminate any of their decorations and in any way that would cause a concern about a protected class or a protected component. If the seller wants to display it, then and the seller feels comfortable displaying it, then they need to be given the latitude to do that. And we do not encourage them or discourage them from changing their perspectives on that. Anybody else have any comments on that?
Yeah, I think you got to say, like, depersonalizing the home is an important part anyway. Say it's not about you or anything wrong with what you are sharing or your concerns or fears about your kids. I think it's better as a blanket policy to depersonalize as much as possible, and say, got to project to the new owner the life they will live here, not your life and any judgments or assumptions they might make about your life you have lived here. So that's I think you can avoid that pretty easily.
But keep in mind that we can't, depersonalizing is one thing, but we cannot advise or guide our clients to remove any items that are of a protected class. So things like religious insignia or religious decorations or items, or anything that would be culturally or ethnically significant. We cannot be guiding or advising our clients to remove or to change their decorations on the basis of that. If we're talking about depersonalizing, that's great and that's fine, and we leave it at that.
Right. Neutral is best. Don't point out. And we're talking Maryland, but DC also, remember, political affiliations are protected class. So certain politicians stuff all over. It is probably wise that they neutralize, and you show them an example of what a neutral place with just home goods and stuff looks like, instead of saying take that specific thing down.
Yeah.
Read between the lines.
Yeah, that's a good point. Good point. All right.
Would you feel comfortable just saying we generally recommend that political and religious items come down? I think that's direct enough, but also not discriminatory.
I wouldn't venture into that. I wouldn't want that to, any kind of comment like that could come back.
That's not saying we generally recommend Republican things come down. You're not saying that. You're just saying we generally recommend political and religious items are not visible during.
Well, there's the broker advice to keep you out of jail. It's a practical way you describe it, Dave. So I think what you're saying, Dave, making it is skirting a line, which Dan's saying, avoid the line. But I think, you're not different ways to point people towards things they could do as examples and avoid any specific mention of the stuff that they should take down.
A question we should be asking ourselves is, the guidance that I'm going to give my client here going to come back to bite me later on if somebody wants to file a complaint against me because of it? And if there are religious items in the property, and I'm just using religion as one example, but if there are religious items in the property and you comment and say that, we generally recommend that you remove your religious items, or that you make your home neutral, religiously neutral, or something to that effect, is there a potential for that client then to file a grievance or complaint against you? There might be, you know, and do you want to be on the receiving end of that kind of complaint and having to fight that complaint? Probably not. So my guidance would be to avoid that kind of topic altogether. Keep your comments based on neutrality and decluttering and depersonalizing. And I wouldn't go any further than that.
Yep.
All right. Grant release of broker, no, we already talked about that. Home security systems that record audio. Sellers advise that Maryland law prohibits audio recording of private conversations without the consent of all parties. Seller may view the penalties for violating the law, which are contained in section 10402 of the Courts and Judicial Proceedings article. So here we have a reference to the law. And if we were to Google this, click the link or Google that, you have a reference to the law, and you can find out how complying with the law is easy to do and what the limitations of it. And so I would refer your clients to that and make yourselves aware of that so that you don't violate the law. Seller acknowledges that the seller has read and understands the provisions of paragraph 10. Fair housing with respect to race, color, religion, sex, national origin, handicap, or familial status. The property is offered in compliance with the Civil Rights Act of 1968 and the Fair Housing Amendments Act under federal law. Additionally, the property shall be offered in compliance with anti-discrimination provisions of Maryland law and any local, county, and municipal fair housing laws. So we should be up to date with our fair housing compliance and continuing education requirements. And we should be referring to those classes frequently. And I would encourage refreshers on fair housing very frequently. I think that helps to serve us to make sure that we are staying in compliance to fair housing policies and laws. All right, seller responsibility for insurance. Broker shall not be responsible for the care, the physical condition of the property. The seller shall remain solely responsible for the care and physical condition of the property, including but not limited to the cost of all utilities, maintenance, and the physical security of the premises and all personal property, and maintaining adequate property and personal injury insurance during the term of this agreement. And brokers shall have no liability for such matters. So once in a while, we come into situations where there are sellers, particularly if they're located, far away, maybe in another country or maybe, across the country, across the United States somewhere, and they don't have physical control of the property. They don't have possession of the property. And yet they are looking to you for taking care of the property while it's listed. Keep in mind that your errors and omissions insurance does not cover you for that kind of an activity because it specifically is disclosing here that the seller is responsible for that and that the brokerage is not responsible for that. So keep in mind that if you voluntarily agree to try to do that and something goes wrong, then you're probably going to be on your own for that. So I would push back on any sellers who try to loop you into the obligations to help them care for the property. Seller is hereby notified that repairs of the property may require the individual engaged to perform such repairs to be duly licensed. So specifically when we're talking about hazardous materials, hazardous substances, lead-based paint, the laws surrounding the remediation of those issues for contractors, for plumbing work, for electrical work, for general contractors, all of those things for work that needs to get done. Anything that we are referring, anytime we are referring contractors for the property, we've got to be able to make sure that we verify their licensing status in Maryland, and we are held liable if we do not verify that information before recommending those people to our clients. So we've got to, if you're going to recommend anybody, it is our legal obligation to make sure that everybody is licensed and bonded and insured. Any questions?
Send them to, from Maryland, the DLLR site to confirm licensure. So not, even if someone tells you they're licensed and says they are, always, you know, say before you cut a check, you know, double checking on the Maryland site. Save
Yep.
your, by pointing them to other resources and put in writing that you recommend they check and where they check.
Yeah, don't take anybody's word for it. Make them show you their license number, and then verify that, you know, on the website, and verify that you've checked it. Absolutely. All right, broker's compensation. The amount of broker compensation is not prescribed by law or established by any membership organization with which the broker is affiliated. In the event of a sale, exchange, or transfer, the compensation paid to the shall be blank. And so here we are able to define what our commission is going to be. So without talking about specific numbers of percentages or anything, we can go ahead and say X percent of the total sale price. Some sellers may want you to go ahead and be more specific and maybe limit it to net sale price. But if you're going to describe a net sale price, you've got to be able to define what is net, is, you know, what constitutes the net. So, you know, is that net after taxes, transfer and recordation taxes? What is the net? Describe what the net is. Don't just say don't just refer it to the net there. In addition, you can put your transaction fee here as well. So what is your best practice on this, Harrison? Do you have anything specifically?
Yeah, we put percentage of sales price, total percentage of sales price. And here it is including what the total amount. And then later you put what you're offering to cooperate with another brokerage. And then we always take into account what the office admin fee is. And then we've got a consistent amount that we add as an additional admin fee on top of it. So put blank amount of sales price, right? Of sales price. So that lets you know how the calculation is done, plus X administration fee.
All right. Anybody have questions? The compensation shall be deemed to have been earned by the broker and shall be due and payable by the seller to the broker if A, during the term of this agreement or any extension thereof, the broker produces a ready, willing, and able buyer to purchase the property at the list price or at other such prices accepted by seller or agreed upon in writing between the seller and the broker. Or so that's one scenario. Okay, the second one is seller shall enter into a written agreement to sell, lease, exchange, convey, or transfer the property to any person or entity whether such person or entity shall have been procured by the broker, by the seller, or by any other person or entity in which event seller within 72 hours thereof shall furnish broker a copy of such written agreement. Or number 3, if during the period of blank days, the following expiration or termination of this agreement, the seller shall enter into a written agreement to sell, lease, exchange, or convey to the transfer the property to any person who or to any entity which with knowledge of seller or any agent of seller inspected or made inquiry about the property, negotiated purchase or exchange the property during the term of this agreement or any extension thereof, in which event seller within 72 hours thereof shall furnish the broker a copy of the written agreement. So those are some conditions and terms where we have earned the commission and the compensation. Now, when we talk about the first one, if you produced a ready, willing, and able buyer at the list price, you know, those are the terms and conditions that define what we've been entitled to receive commission. Now, different people have different practices about this. Do we always execute and do we always hold the seller liable for that commission? A lot of times we don't. It's not generally typically very wise business practice to chase after sellers for commissions, you know, for various things, but there may be some terms and conditions and situations where you may need to. Keep in mind that it's a tall order to pursue and it's a difficult task to accomplish and collect on that kind of compensation in a situation like that. But sometimes you run into some sellers who just decide to have cold feet, or just decide that they don't want to actually sell, even though you gave them an offer that met their needs. What are your thoughts, Harrison and David, on that?
Yeah, I think you got to be thoughtful about well, I guess there's two thoughts. If you do the work and actually complete the job to provide a ready, willing, and able buyer, and something crazy of the seller's fault comes up, then you probably have a case to continue to pursue. But as your volume picks up, I just think of like my time, effort, energy, and like, is it worth actually further pursuing if they're misrepresented, lied, did something crazy, did something illegal to tell you about? I think you got to take every case as it comes and stay in touch with the brokerage about like what your time, effort, and resources are worth to try to pursue money. Like I say, I don't want to throw good money at a bad problem. And a lot of listings, when I had one recently like this, that, I mean, the guy misrepresented what he owed, and we were a couple days before closing, and he owed an extra 50K, and then said, you know, screw, yeah, that one. And I'm like, sure, could I try to pursue this guy and get him to pay me or do something else? Yeah, but what is my time, energy, and effort worth to keep going at it? So I don't know, Dave, what you got to say about that?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. It's, you always have to weigh your time and how much that's worth. You also have to weigh, like, you know, what this could do to your reputation too. I mean, if you're potentially going after a commission that you really didn't earn or deserve in some way or another, and the person that you're working with is well connected, you have to be careful. Your name could be dragged through the mud. I've had a couple instances where, for example, I had a valid listing agreement. We were literally signing it as a knock came on the door from an agent who was showing it because it was already listed with a previous agent. The listing agreement had expired. I showed that agent or client the unit as if I was, you know, I've been showing it for years, and, you know, showed them all the amenities in the building. And lo and behold, that agent wrote an offer, and I said, okay, well, make sure if you write an offer, you send it to me because we have the listing agreement. And she sent it to the old lister because that's what was in the MLS. And we were on the right side of things. We literally could have pursued it and won because we had the valid listing agreement and the old one had expired. But, you know, was it worth it? I had literally just met the seller that day. And, you know, you just have to decide whether it's worth it to go after a seller like that. On the other hand, I'm not sure, I don't think we've covered this part, but in the event of default by the buyer, the earnest money deposit, according to the GCAR contract, is split 50-50 between the seller and the brokerage, the listing brokerage. In this contract, you have to define how that earnest money deposit is split. So I recommend you do the same thing, 50-50. Now, is that one an easy one to get? Not very, but it can be worth pursuing. So we had a developer, and by the way, just for future reference, understand this: developers should not be trusted, although there are some good ones out there. In general, developers think that they kind of run the game, and they will manipulate and play with you, and sometimes just not abide by the terms of the contract at all. And in this case, that's exactly what happened. The developer decided that his earnest money deposit was his, even though he had defaulted on the contract. He didn't show up to settlement, and then he tried to negotiate the price down by 30% in order to go to settlement, which we, of course, the seller did not agree to. And he had $50,000 deposited with the title company. And again, very important that once you're under contract, you follow up to ensure the earnest money deposit is deposited. If it's not deposited, you basically have nothing. But make sure it's deposited. If it's deposited, and if it's a number like $50,000, hell yeah, we're going to go after that. And so I actually worked with the seller in this case, and I said, look, you're getting half of this and we're getting half of it. I will split the cost of the attorney with you. I want to make sure you're the one that's named as a complainant or the plaintiff, because I don't really want my name involved. But I will split the cost of the attorney with you to go after this earnest money deposit. And wouldn't you know it, we got 35,000 back out of the 50,000. And guess who 50% of that 35,000 went to? Went to me. So that was worth it. But again, it's all about a calculation of how easy will it be to go after it, how much money is there, and how much time will you have to spend to get it. And then also, are there going to be any repercussions for these actions that you're taking with your reputation, with the industry, with your career? Because you don't want to blow your whole career and your reputation with other agents and potentially well-connected buyers or sellers on one commission or even half of one earnest money deposit. You have to take that calculation very seriously.
Absolutely. So what David was just talking about there was item, 3 there. If during the period of blank days, so the situation there that he was talking about fell into that paragraph. And even though at the end, he had taken the listing, meeting great negotiation. So in that case, there's an exception to the new listing taking priority. And what he was talking about there is that his new listing should have covered him with that, but he decided that it wasn't worthy. It wasn't worth trying to chase it. So, and again, item number B here, if the seller defaults, doesn't meet or is voluntarily agrees to terminate a sale, then the total amount is due there. And if the seller breaches this agreement in any way. So those are some pretty specific, powerful tools. And so, we can use that as leverage to our sellers to make sure that they understand that they've got to perform this. And they may not only have obligations to the buyer, but they also have obligations to us as a brokerage. Now, trying to enforce those things, like David said, is another story, but the language is here and is clear.
And hey, Dan, just because I do have to hop off, I'm sorry, before noon, one piece of advice I'll give folks that, especially for newer agents, with both listing agreements and purchase contracts, we have our preferred title relationships within KWCP, which I believe are universal title now.
Yeah,
right?
universal only.
Universal title. So Dave Mason, his team are awesome. And they have a lot of younger junior associates and business development people. If you have questions about the contract, set up a time to talk through with them more details to get talking points about what things mean in supplement to the training that Dan and his associate broker squad provide. That was a way that I helped learn more about what the different provisions of both listing and buyer contract meant. And it can help you get even more. This is step 1.0, but 2.0 and coming back can be engaging these other folks that want your business, and they will help you learn some stuff as well. So that's just another thing in addition to this I think you should do. And happy to be a resource. All my contact info is out there. And thanks for letting me jump on this morning with you, Dan.
I appreciate your time, Harrison, and greatly appreciate you. You're a powerhouse and a resource extraordinaire. So we thank you deeply. I guess we could probably.
I want to echo Harrison too. Just really take advantage of the resources we have, both with Dan. I'm always available. Harrison, I'm sure, would be happy to take any personal calls too. But the title companies are there for a reason, and they actually love that kind of one-on-one time with agents to help us all succeed. So use all the resources we have.
Absolutely. Let's take about a 5-minute break here, and then we'll jump into our next session, and we'll kind of go from there. And we'll just take a 5-minute break, and then we'll jump right back into this. All right, folks. Thank you very much. We'll be right back shortly.
Thank you.
Okay, so we are back for a short little 5-minute break. So we were talking earlier about compensation due to the brokerage. And the ways that we are entitled to receive compensation from our clients, the sellers in these transactions. So just wanted to cover that. Were there any questions from any of you agents out there about ways that is about any of the language here in these sections regarding owing the seller owing us the compensation and how that plays out in real life?
Question that.
Pardon me?
I have a question about the, I think it's section 3 here, the one we just covered.
Okay, yeah.
The blank box where it says the time frame or the time period, is there like a rule of thumb on what we should put there?
Yeah, I mean, different people put different things. Typically, I have usually put in like 30 days in there. But different people have different ideas about that. Just keep in mind that that there is a limit. There is that limit. I usually put 30 days, but that's a personal preference.
Okay, thanks.
Yep, you bet. All right, and keep in mind that so with the knowledge or consent of any agent or seller inspected or made inquiry about the property or negotiated to purchase or exchange the property during the term of this agreement or any extension thereof, in which event the seller within 72 hours thereof shall furnish broker a copy of such written agreement. So if this is if this seller decides to enter into a new agreement with another listing agent, it voids out this paragraph number 3. So if they get into another listing agreement with somebody after the expiration of yours, then there is no 30-day period. So if they get into a new listing agreement, there is no 30-day period or whatever blank period of time you put in there. All right. Okay, so let's move on down to the compensation due to the broker shall be a charge against the property and shall be paid at settlement as a convenience to the seller. However, the seller acknowledges and agrees that the settlement on the property shall not be a condition precedent to seller's obligation to broker as herein provided. So this paragraph specifically says that getting us to the settlement table and performing on the settlement is not a requirement for us getting paid. The performance of getting the buyer to the table and getting the contract done is what gets us paid, assuming that the seller does not default. If the seller defaults, then we are entitled to compensation. If the buyer defaults, that's not the seller's fault and we are not. All right. If the broker prevails in any action brought to obtain payment of the compensation, the broker shall also be entitled to recover in such action reasonable attorney fees and court costs. So typically, whenever there's any kind of litigation, it's a loser pay all kind of a scenario. If a deposit made on any contract or sale is to be forfeited to the seller, or if all or part of the deposit is received by the seller as a settlement made by and between the seller and buyer, blank dollars or blank % of the amount forfeited or received as settlement shall be paid to broker for broker services. So what David Bediz was saying earlier, just before our break, is this is where he puts in the 50. This is what his recommendation was and what he did, and he put the 50% of any forfeited amount. And this is what he puts in his agreements. You can do what you want there. This is a provision that's provided there for you to do whatever is best for your own business. But like I said, David just does it with the 50% in that field. All right, moving along. Again, stop me if you have questions. Please actually voice up because I don't actually follow the chat too much. So yeah, I don't follow the chat very much, but anyways, feel free to pop up, unmute yourself and ask away if you've got any questions. Harrison and David Bediz had to step out, so we'll be continuing on the class without them. All right. Seller shall have no obligation to pay the compensation to the broker if the property is listed by any other licensed real estate broker following the expiration of this agreement or any extension thereof, or following the termination of this agreement as provided herein, unless such termination by the seller is for the purpose of avoiding the obligation to the seller to pay the broker compensation of the broker. So if you ever get into a dispute like this, you're going to want to get me involved or your lead broker in your specific office. If you're not one of the Capitol Hill agents, Capitol Hill, DuPont, and Hyattsville agents, which are my territory, you'll want to get your lead broker involved otherwise. All right. Authority to cooperate with other brokers. Brokers shall be entitled to cooperate with other brokers as subagents of the broker and or brokers retained by the prospective buyers or represent buyers' interests. Seller consents to broker cooperation and a fee with subagents or buyer's agents, collectively cooperating brokers. Broker shall pay to any subagent who has earned and is entitled to share in the fee of blank of the sale price, and then broker shall pay to any buyer agent who has earned and is entitled to share in the fee of blank percent. So we're not going to talk about percentages, but we're not going to talk about specific numbers here in this paragraph today. Let's not talk, but if anybody has any questions about this, feel free to pop up and ask away. Generally, as a matter of my own business practice, I prefer not to have subagents involved in my transactions. That's just my policy. I'm not saying that you have to do it that way, but it's my policy that I prefer to have that. I don't mind if somebody goes in and shows one of my listings with the understanding whom the real estate agent represents, disclosure made to them, so that they can show the property as a subagent. They can do that, but if they're going to write the contract, I choose to not participate with subagents in that. They can change their status from a subagency relationship having viewed the property in subagency, but if they want to write a contract on my property, they need to change their status to have a buyer agency agreement with their buyers in order to submit their offer in and receive compensation on my transactions. That's the way that I do it in my business. But you don't, there are different philosophies on that. That's just the way that I do it. Does anybody have a question?
Yeah, I had a question. When it comes to, like you said, having someone showing your listing, is there a particular disclosure, paperwork, or anything that needs to be filed separately to say this person is showing my listing or so forth, or is that just compensation from our part?
So at the beginning of this class today at 10 o'clock, we started out with a disclosure of with reference to the document that we use, and which is called the, hold on a second here, let me get to it, which is the understanding whom the real estate agent represents, this one here. So
correct.
If you're going to be showing a property and you don't yet have a buyer agency agreement, you must use this form, okay? And use that with the buyer. That is something that the agent showing the property must have this and must have sent this form to the buyer showing them that you are not representing their interests and that you are representing the interests of the seller at that moment of the showing. Now, this doesn't need to be delivered to the listing agent. This needs to be held in your files. And if it's needed later on, then you'll move with that.
Okay.
Now there is an ability for you to be able to change and there's a change of agency status form. So let's say you are coming into my listing, you've got a buyer in your hands, and your buyer does not have a buyer's agency agreement with you, but you have given them the understanding whom the real estate agent represents form. And now they've decided that, you know what, I like this property, I would like to write an offer on it. Now you can go ahead and use the change of status, which is in the Maryland docs. And I'm going to show you that right here. And that's going to be down here in the Maryland real estate documents. And I'm going to put change, agency change acknowledgement document. And here, when you open this document up, this acknowledges to the parties that this document here is going to be a document that you're going to use, and it's going to be a communication from you as the buyer's agent, because now you've converted yourself into a buyer agency agreement. And before this document, you were actually a subagent of the seller. Now you're changing your status with the seller to say, okay, before I was a subagent of you, but now I'm representing the buyer and I'm changing my status. And then your seller is going to sign off on it here.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, my pleasure, my pleasure. Anybody else have any other questions on that?
And is there a similar document to that in DC?
In DC, let me think. I do not believe in DC that there is a change of status document. The agency, now in DC, we have a different document that is used to describe your agency relationship with everybody that you work with. So there is a form that you use to describe the agency relationship. There is not a form to change the agency relationship later on, but there is a form to disclose the relationship that you have with them, absolutely. So, and you can watch the on-demand video classes for the DC buyer agency agreement to learn more about that. Okay. So we talked about that. Ministerial acts. So can somebody, one of our agents here online, I've been talking this whole time, my mouth is getting dry. Can somebody tell me what is a ministerial act? If you're a listing agent, what's an example of a ministerial act? Anybody? Anybody? Somebody.
That actually was going to be my question, actually, because when I read that, I didn't even know what that was.
All right. Okay. Well, thanks for being honest about that. Appreciate that. So a ministerial act is anything that any kind of activity that you do that is not a function of your agency obligation to your client, but maybe a function, an action that is assisting the other side in a transaction. And so, for example, one example might be a ministerial act might very well be if you're the listing agent and you've got let's say you've got a contract on the in the transaction, and let's say that the buyer's agent is not available to do. Let's say that the buyer's agent is not available to do the home inspection with you, with their client, but you decide, you know what, I have a free afternoon. I'll go ahead and open the door for the buyer and let them walk through my listing. And so my action of opening the door for the buyer is not a breach or violation of my agency obligations to my seller. It's simply a ministerial act to help them facilitate the transaction and move it along. And I'm doing this as a favor to the buyer's agent to help facilitate that process. Now, it's probably not a smart thing for the buyer agent to have them do that. It's not the best way to handle that situation, but a ministerial act is simply an insignificant gesture or action that you are doing to help the other party in the transaction to accomplish the common objectives. So opening a door or providing a document to the other side, or providing any kind of assistance, like giving them the contact information for the condo fee, for the condo association, things like that. That's what a
So anything related to the contract and to fulfillment of the sale of the property, I guess, right?
As long as it's not a violation of your agency obligations to your primary client, yes.
Okay, all right.
It's an insignificant act for the other side, as long as it's not a violation for your own buyer, your own client.
Thank
All
you.
right. Any other questions? Okay, paragraph 17. The deposit will be held by the escrow agent. The seller is advised that an escrow agent, other than a Maryland licensed real estate broker, is not subject to the same legal requirements that Maryland licensed real estate brokers are under the Maryland Real Estate Brokers Act. So again, we have the reference to a law, which is the Maryland Real Estate Brokers Act, concerning the holding and release of deposit monies. So if you ever want to know what the rules and regulations are about brokers holding earnest money deposits, they're all contained here in this law. All right, so that's where you can reference that, go and find out more information about it. You can Google that and get more information that way. If the deposit is going to be held by a third party, like a title company, other than a Maryland licensed real estate broker involved in the transactions, the parties are required to enter into a separate written escrow agreement, binding upon the parties and the escrow agent that complies with section 10802 of the Real Property Code. So again, this is another term that defines how escrow agreements are supposed to be managed. So keep in mind that the escrow agreements are monitored and characterized and must be in compliance with this law. So keep in mind that whether you're a buyer or a seller, whether you're a buyer's agent or a seller's agent, you both have liabilities and obligations to ensure that the earnest money gets deposited when the contract says that it's supposed to get deposited. Even if you're a listing agent, it's your obligation and you owe that duty to your seller to ensure that when the contract says that the earnest money was supposed to be deposited in 2 business days, that it actually did get deposited in 2 business days. And you are in violation of your obligations to your seller if you do not tell your seller after that second day that the earnest money was supposed to be delivered, that it did not get delivered. So if the earnest money doesn't get delivered when the contract says, and you don't tell your seller, you're in liability to your seller, and your seller has a justifiable grievance against you. Similarly, if you're a buyer's agent and your buyer is supposed to deposit the earnest money within 2 days and they don't, you have an obligation to report that to the other side of the transaction, to the seller. You have an obligation to do that, to report that to the seller's agent, to the listing agent, and to the seller themselves. And you simultaneously have an obligation to report that to your broker, your supervising broker. And by doing that, by reporting the fact that your buyer did not deposit the earnest money when they said that they were going to deposit it, you now are removing yourself from liability by having reported it to your broker and to the other side. You have now removed yourself from the liability, and now you are off the hook because of that disclosure. If you do not disclose that to your broker, and if you do not disclose it to the seller, you are on the hook, and then you could be held liable for damages in that event. And you will be subject to the disciplinary action. And the reason for that is because the brokerage is required by law to inform the real estate commission if you do not advise about the failure of your client to make that deposit. So I want to make sure that everybody understands that very clearly. If you do not ensure that your buyer client deposits that earnest money, you could be held liable for it if you do not report that to the seller, listing agent, and to your supervising broker immediately, because your broker is required to report that to the commission. And if you have not protected yourself by disclosing it to those parties, you're liable. Anybody have any questions about that? I want to make sure everybody understands that. Okay, I assume nobody's speaking, so I assume that that's everybody understands. All right. Paragraph 18, smoke alarm notice. Seller is hereby notified of changes in Maryland law regarding smoke alarms and smoke detectors. Again, the reference to the law is right here. So if you have any questions about what the law says, look it up. Google that and you will find the answer to your questions. The type of smoke alarm required in a dwelling depends on the age of the property. As of January 1st, 2018, among other changes, no alarm, battery powered or hardwired, may be older than 10 years from the date of manufacture, and if battery powered, be sealed, tamper resistant units incorporating a silence hush button which use long life batteries. There are penalties for non-compliance. Additionally, some jurisdictions have more stringent rules for new construction or rentals. Seller is advised to verify compliance with the city or county in which the property is located. So that's saying here that the seller has obligation to verify that compliance. It's not saying that the brokerage is obligated to mandate that. It's clearly stating that the seller is obligated to verify their compliance. And the contract is going to require, the sales contract, whenever we get a buyer, is actually going to require that they have complied. And if they didn't comply, then the seller is in violation and could be in default of that contract. And a default like that could cause a delay in settlement. Seller may view the smoke alarm requirements at this link. So click on the links. Whenever you see links, whenever you see references to the laws, go and research those online and you'll get your good answers. All right, moving on to lead paint. Seller acknowledges that the property, if constructed before 1978, is subject to federal law as to the presence of lead-based paint and or lead-based paint hazards. All right. So when we are talking about this, seller represents and warrants to the broker's agents and cooperating brokers and agents, intending that they rely upon such warranty representations that the property was constructed. You must have an answer in these fields, in one of those fields. You cannot leave that blank. And when we get to the disclosures later on, you will notice that you do not have a right to leave those blank as well when you get to those lead-based paint disclosure documents. So you'll need to either certify that the property was built before 1978, or it was built during or after 1978, or you're uncertain of the date of construction. We're almost never going to have this initialed here. If you're going to have that initialed here as to being uncertain, then you probably need to have a conversation with your lead broker to consider why that is necessary. Almost always, it's not going to be this block. There's going to be evidence to support exactly when the property was built. So
I had a quick question regarding that. I was told that there's two, if the property was built prior to 78, that there's two forms. There's both a federal and a state lead-based paint.
Correct.
Okay, just wanted to make sure.
Yep, there is. That's absolutely correct. And there's actually a lead mitigation hazard form as well in Maryland. So just be aware of that too. And we cover that in another class. All right, if the seller is uncertain as to the date of the property construction, seller agrees that for the purpose of the sale of the contemplated by this agreement, the property will be treated as though it had been constructed before 1978. So if it does get checked here that the seller is uncertain about when the property was constructed, the fact that it's checked here is equal to the fact that it is constructed to 1978. If Title 10 applies to the property, seller agrees to comply fully with the requirements set forth in the EPA and HUD Real Estate Notification Disclosure Rule. Accordingly, if applicable, seller is required to disclose to the buyer, based upon seller's actual knowledge, all known lead-based paint hazards in the property and provide buyer with any available reports in the seller's possession relating to lead-based paint or lead-based paint hazards applicable to the property. Additionally, the disclosure of information on lead-based paint or lead-based paint hazards shall be attached and made a part of the contract so that you can provide that to your buyers who make offers. For detailed information regarding the EPA and HUD Real Estate Notification Disclosure Rule, sellers should visit this link. All right, anybody have questions on that? Okay, moving forward. All right, it's important that we point this next paragraph out to our sellers, because if there's going to need, if your property was built before 1978 and you're going to need to do any kind of work or repairs to the property, it needs to be, we need to make sure that we articulate to your sellers that it is their obligation to comply with paragraph B. And so if you imagine that in paragraph B, that the lead renovation, repair, and painting rule as adopted by the EPA effective April 22nd, 2010. Now, this is a federal rule. This is a federal law. This applies everywhere in the United States. If the improvements in the property were built before 1978, and in this sentence, the word improvements simply means a house, a building, a structure, okay? An improvement doesn't mean a remodel, it means the actual home. So you've got the land is the real estate, the fee simple land, and then the improvements on land are the structures, right? That's the core definition of what an improvement is in when we're talking about real estate. An improvement is a structure. It's another word for a structure. Okay, if the structure was built before 1978, contractors engaged by the seller to renovate, repair, or paint the property must certify to the APA where such work will disturb more than 6 square feet of paint per room for interior projects. So if you're going to be doing any kind of work on the house and you're going to be disturbing more than 6 square feet. So if you can imagine, let's say you've got a very small window, maybe it's 24 inches by 24 inches, right? So within that 24 inches by 24 inches, you've got 4 square feet, right? Because that's 2 feet, 2 feet, you've got 4 feet. Now, in addition to that square feet for a window, if we're talking about replacing a window, you've got 4 feet there, plus you've got all of the perimeter feet surrounding that 4 square foot window. So you've got a total there of a much greater area of square footage just by replacing that one window of interior space. So that the purpose of this discussion is to demonstrate making any kind of repairs to sanding any paint down, repairing a window, replacing a window, even if it's just a small little area like that, it's easily going to fit within the 6 square foot rule that complies, that says that the seller must hire somebody that's EPA certified. And when they're EPA certified, they must do the work in accordance with EPA rules to mitigate the dispersal of lead-based paint hazards. So just make sure that you point that out to them. And that's what the rule requires. They've got to comply with that, and the seller could be liable if they don't.
Quick question on that. The DLLR list along with like whether or not the contractor is licensed if they're EPA certified?
Yes, I believe so. And if not, then you can check with the EPA website as well.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. All right, paragraph 20 regarding disclosure of deferred water sewer assessments. So sometimes we call this a front foot benefit, deferred water sewer assessments. So typically the way that this happens is when you've got a situation where a property was built in a development, in a subdivision, and when the developer first initially builds the development, they don't want to incur the costs of installing the sewer systems and the water systems themselves, right? They want to defer that and put the burden on that on the future owners of the properties. So what they do is they set up a legal means by which the cost of that will be spread over the next 20 or 30 years. And the subsequent owners of these properties that they sell will pay for the installation of the water and sewer lines. So if they're going to start a new development, they'll set this system up, they'll install the work, but the water utility will pay for that, the actual installation of it, and then the unit owners that buy into that area will pay for the installation of that water and sewer over the next 30 years or so, as detailed in that, and then that's carried on. After 30 years, the fee stops and there's no longer a front foot benefit. But that's essentially what a front foot benefit is and what this
Quick question. How would you be able to find that information? Would that be something that, like an assessment that you get every year, or?
So sometimes it occurs, sometimes it's included as part of the property taxes. Sometimes it's included as a special fee charged by the water company. Or other times it is simply a separate entity altogether that the seller is obligated to pay that fee separately. So you would want to, first of all, number one, ask your seller, are you paying a separate fee on a yearly basis or on a monthly basis besides your water usage for water and sewer, deferred water and sewer? Ask them that. Secondly, you'll want to find out and you look up the tax record and to see if it states in the tax record that there is a special tax assessed to the property to cover that special assessment for the water and sewer lines. That's a second way that it could be there. So it's either done as part of, or it could be done as part of their water bill. So there could be one line that covers their normal water usage and one line for their sewer usage, and then another line for deferred water special assessments. So usually it'll be one of those three means that it'll occur. If it's not one of those three means, then there probably isn't a front foot benefit.
Perfect, thank you.
Yep. The law does not apply in a county that has adopted. Okay, so basically all of what I just described is what is covered here in this section. If you really want more information, again, feel free to, this is a reference to the law. So Google this symbol, 17505, Business Occupations and Professions article of the Annotated Code of Maryland. You can Google that and get further answers on your questions. So the seller will know if there is any front foot benefit, or they should know. Although one time I sold a property recently And my seller didn't know that there was, but it was already being paid as part of his tax bill. So just by looking at his tax bill, I could see that he was paying it, even though he didn't know that he was paying it. All right, paragraph 21, offers and authority to disclose the existing offers. Seller is advised that the prospective buyers or cooperating brokers may inquire of broker or broker's agents as to whether existing written offers have been received for the purchase of the property. The disclosure of the existence of written offers could be either beneficial or detrimental to the seller. On the one hand, such disclosure could result in the interested buyer making the highest and best offer as promptly as possible. On the other hand, such disclosure could result in the interested buyer electing not to make an offer. So both of those two scenarios are plausible and possible. Personally, for me, I always ask that my sellers allow me to disclose the existence of other offers. So if I've got somebody that, if I've got a listing and I've got an offer on it, then I need to be able to tell the other party, tell other agents and other buyers that I've got another offer in hand. Now, I don't reveal the details of that other offer, but yes, the suggestion that I tell them that I do have other offers in hand is something that I request my sellers to give me the authority to do. Because if they tell me not to do that, and I have somebody that comes up to me and says, "Do you have other offers in hand?" then the only way that I can honestly comply with my seller's wishes is to ignore their question and not answer them. So in other words, I've got a contract I've got an offer on my listing. Another buyer agent comes in and tells me, asks me, "Do you have any offers?" And I respond, "I'm sorry, I can't answer your question." That is telling that new buyer agent, I can't answer their question. That's not very helpful to that buyer agent, and it's not really gonna. The answer is an ambiguous answer that isn't going to be useful, in my opinion. So I always ask the sellers to authorize me to disclose it, because that's what I truthfully would be doing anyways. So it puts me in an awkward position when I have to not reveal that kind of information. That's just my opinion. Others can do what they want.
But why would a seller opt to not disclose?
Well, exactly for the reason that was written here. So if you let's say, and this is a very real scenario. So if you have a scenario where you've got a listing and you've got 12 offers in hand, and you've got another buyer agent who asks you, "Do you have any offers in hand?" and you say, "Yes, I have 12 offers." There's a pretty good chance that the buyer agent and the buyer may decide, "You know what? We don't even want to bother competing with 12 other offers. We're just gonna skip it." Right? So that's a reason why the seller may not want to disclose it. But the question that I usually get is, "Do you have any other offers?" And if I say, "Yes, I have other offers," I don't necessarily have to say I have 12 offers. I just say, "Yes, I have other offers." And I leave it at that. I don't disclose how many other offers I have. The fact that I have other offers is enough information. And it's a balancing act between balancing my seller's wishes and balancing the information that I need to give to the other buyer's agent. to encourage them to write an offer without discouraging them by wigging them out.
Got it. That makes sense. I was just thinking with this seller's market, it's probably unlikely that there won't be a few
Yeah.
offers for every home that's in place. So just
Right.
trying to figure out why. But
Yeah,
it makes-
and currently we are in a seller's market, but keep in mind, we may not always be in a seller's market. So that's the current environment now. But we can certainly, you know, that can change tomorrow. So absolutely. All right. Broker and broker's agents to disclose the existence of other offers on the property in response to inquiries from the buyers or cooperating brokers. If the disclosure is authorized, the broker agents shall also disclose. If asked whether an offer was obtained by the listing agent, another agent in the broker's firm, or by a cooperating broker, such authority does not include the disclosure of the terms and conditions of such offers. So I would never disclose the terms of the offer, but I could certainly disclose that I have another offer. All right. Presentation, stop. Sorry, my dog. Presentation of offers. Brokers shall present to the seller in a timely manner all written offers, counter offers, even if the property is subject to an existing contract of sale, unless the seller has waived the obligation in writing. So the words timely manner are not clearly defined. It's a very subjective phrase. And some agents take that to mean, you know, maybe a week, maybe a few days. And some people determine it to be immediately. Personally, my business practice includes, my business practice is when I'm the listing agent, to present all offers upon my receipt of them. So I will, as soon as I receive an offer, I will deliver it to my seller. Now that doesn't mean that my seller is obligated to respond to it right away, but I want my sellers to have it in hand immediately. That's just my business practice. That's not what you have to do. Just keep in mind that the word timely is a subjective term, and you don't want to hold on it indefinitely. So just keep that in mind. And you will probably, if the longer you hold on it, the more complaints you will get from buyer's agents who are waiting for a response from you. All right, the home warranty. Again, we've got the brokerage requires a home warranty disclosure document that the buyer and seller must sign. So they need to be aware that the home warranties are available. The broker does or does not offer the opportunity for the seller to purchase a home warranty to be enforced during the listing period, which will transfer to the buyer upon settlement. And then the seller signs off on that right there. If you all could bear with me for one moment, I'll be right back. All right, sorry about that. Okay, notice of the property condition disclosure disclaimer. So we all have, in all jurisdictions, we typically have a property condition disclosure statement. Sometimes they call it a seller's disclosure. The sellers advise that under Maryland law, again, we have reference to the law right here. So Google that and you will find answers to any questions that you might have on that. The buyer is entitled to receive the Maryland Residential Property Disclosure and Disclaimer Statement. So keep in mind, we cover this document in another class, but essentially this document is a two-part document. The first part is an actual disclosure of material conditions, and the second part is a disclaimer. you don't fill out both sections of it. You only fill one or the other. Okay, you either disclose the seller's knowledge of defects or you disclaim the seller's knowledge of defects. It's not both. But you must include the entirety of the entire document, but the seller will only sign one part or the other. The seller must deliver the completed disclosure disclaimer statement to the buyer on or before the buyer's entering into the contract. So the best way to handle that is to upload it into View Docs in Bright MLS. And that's so that when the buyer's agent goes and selects the listing in the MLS, they can click on the tab and download all of the documents. That's the best way that we can ensure that the seller has delivered it to the buyer on or before the buyer entering into the contract of sale to offer the purchase. With the exception of a land installment contract, an option to purchase agreement, and a lease agreement obtaining an option to purchase provision, in which case the disclosure disclaimer statement must be delivered to the buyer before the execution of the contract by the buyer. A buyer who does not receive the disclosure statement on or before the execution of the offer by the buyer has the unconditional right upon written notice to the seller to rescind the contract of sale at any time before the receipt of the disclosure. So if you ratify a contract today and you have not delivered the seller's disclosure, the property disclosure, to the buyer, and it is not included, signed by the buyer has a right to void the contract until you deliver it to the seller, to the buyer, and tack on an additional 5 days following the receipt of it. So by not delivering it and letting it be available on demand, you automatically are tacking on an additional 5 days after the delivery of that seller's disclosure, where the buyer could walk away. Why would you take a listing and create an opportunity for a buyer to walk away like that? You want to eliminate that contingency possibility early. And the best way to do that is to make sure it's available in the View documents in Bright MLS. All right. We're gonna go ahead and skip over the majority of this. That's basically the essence of what that paragraph means. All right, violation notices. Seller is advised that the contract of sale may require the seller to convey the property free and clear of all violation notices. So if the county or the state or any kind of jurisdiction has issued any kind of a violation or stop work order or any other kind of violation notice, that the seller has to deliver that free and clear of any of those kinds of activities. Conservation easements. Some of our areas in Maryland are designated as conservation areas. And there are special easements that dictate what can and can't happen in those areas in order to protect the environmental issues that they're designed to protect in those specific areas. So our sellers have to be in compliance with those conservation easements. And if they are not in compliance to those, then we have to make them in compliance in order to transfer the property to the buyer, so that they can also be in compliance. So that's not optional, it's a mandatory requirement if you are in a conservation area. All right. Seller hereby represents to the broker, and upon which representation broker is entitled to rely, that the property is not subject to a conservation easement or the restrictions limiting or affecting the uses of the property. So the majority of time we will have that as that will be applicable. If it's not in a conservation area, then you will have the seller initial there. Or if it is in a conservation area, the property is subject to one or more conservation easements and other restrictions, and it could be part of any one of these entities here. So typically, if it is, the seller will know that, and they will disclose that to you in your listing agreement here. So you'll want to make sure that you carefully review these items with them to make sure that these items are not part of any kind of requirements there. If paragraph 2B is initialed by the seller, meaning 2B or B2, a little bit of dyslexia there, is initialed by the seller. Seller has or has not provided a copy of the conservation easement. So a conservation easement is an actual legal document that describes what can and can't be done to that land. So if there is that document and it is in place, the seller will just deliver that to the listing agent so that they can in turn deliver that to the buyers. So keep that in mind. All right, insurability. An informational brochure published by the Maryland Association of Realtors titled "The New Reality of Property Insurance, What You Should Know" is available to explain current issues relative to obtaining insurance coverage for the property. So keep in mind, make sure that you Google that document and provide that for your sellers. And I would actually recommend that you upload that into the View Documents also, so that it's just available for buyers on the property. Keep in mind that the frequency with which your sellers make property claims on their insurance policies could have a very significant impact on the property's CLUE score. A CLUE score is so similar to a credit score for consumers and buyers. Everybody is issued a CLUE score, and properties are also issued CLUE scores. CLUE is a way of insurance companies being able to manage and categorize and measure the amount of risk that a property or an individual has for the likelihood of making another claim. So just like you've got credit scores, that range from low to high, and that talks about your dependability in terms of being able to meet your obligations financially. Equally, the insurance industry has a similar kind of rating system that characterizes how frequently you make a car claim, car accident, or a renter's insurance claim, or a property insurance claim. So if you have filed a lot of property insurance claims on your property, and then the new buyer comes along and tries to obtain new property insurance, that could impact that buyer's ability to qualify for the financing on your property. If you've got a long history of claims, and it now shows up that this property is a high risk insurance property, that could impact the buyer's ability to get good insurance for themselves as well, and it could push their limits out of their debt to income ratios out, so that they would no longer qualify for it. So keep that in mind. Make sure that you have that conversation with your sellers to find out how often they've had claims put on this property. That's an important topic to cover. Anybody have questions on that? All right. Flood disclosure notice. Seller is advised that the property or part of the property may be located in an area established by the government as a floodplain, or otherwise in an area where flood insurance could be required. The National Flood Insurance Program, and you can Google that, establishes flood insurance policy premiums based on the risk of flooding in the area where properties are located. Due to amendments to federal law governing the NFIP, those premiums are constantly increasing. In some cases will rise by a substantial amount over the premiums previously charged. So your seller today who is paying a flood insurance premium at a set rate is going to be paying a lower premium than will a new buyer buying the same house in the same location. So the new premiums are much higher. So keep in mind that just because you're paying a low amount now doesn't mean that the new buyer is going to be paying that equal amount. It is likely going to be a much higher amount, and that could impact the amount of buyers who can qualify to buy your property. So that all of that has impact. All of these little pieces fit together when putting your house on the market.
Interesting.
Anybody have questions on that? All right. So make sure that you Google that. All right. Paragraph 28 is a common. A lot of people don't understand this, don't even know about this. But Maryland has a law that is essentially a law that basically says that if the seller does not live in the property at the time of selling it, they may be subject to a penalty tax that is charged to them, and there are generally some limitations and qualifications for this program. So if the seller does not live in the property and hasn't lived in the property for some amount of time, then they may be subject to living, and if they're living out of state, then they may be subject to this tax. If they're still living in the state, it's not an issue. So the seller acknowledges pursuant to section 10912 of the Tax General Article Annotated Code of Maryland, look it up in Google, that if the seller is a non-resident individual of the state of Maryland or is a non-resident entity which is not formed under the laws of Maryland, so meaning an LLC or something, and is not qualified by or registered within the State Department of Tax Assessments and Taxation to do business in the state of Maryland, the deed or instruments of writing that affects a change of ownership to the property may not be recorded with the clerk or filed with the Maryland State Department of Taxation unless payment is made by the seller in the amount of 8% in the total payment. So that's 8% of the total sale price. That's not 8% of the profit. That's 8% of the total sale price. All right, or 8.25% of the total payment to a non-resident entity. The amount of payment for non-resident individual is subject to adjustment on a recurring basis by the Comptroller of Maryland. The amount of the payment of a non-resident entity is subject from time to time to change by the act of the Maryland General Assembly. Seller acknowledges that the amounts as set forth in A and B above may be greater or less than the actual amounts due by the seller at the time of settlement. So this becomes an issue when you've sold a property to a client. They later decide to move out of the property, and let's say they move to Oregon somewhere or whatever, and they still own the property here and they're renting it out. And they've now lived out of state for a number of years, and they now decide it's time to sell the property. They now are subject to this tax until they file their next tax returns and liquidate that amount according to what their tax returns supposedly. So keep in mind that that's a tax that if you're dealing with out-of-state owners, this is something that could very well impact them. And we need to make sure that that is calculated beforehand when you're taking the listing. All right. Anybody have questions on that?
Hey, Dan, what if they're not renting the property?
So if they're not renting the property and they still live out of state, you mean?
Yes, identical scenario, just they're not renting the property.
If they've been living out of I believe that the rule is if they in the last year, if they have not lived in the property within the last year, then they have to pay the tax. And it doesn't really matter if they've been renting it or not. It's if they have not lived in the property, if they have not lived in the state of Maryland for the last year, then they must pay the tax.
Wow.
Okay.
Is
that a flat rate? Is that a flat rate per year, or is this a flat rate?
It's a flat rate per the transaction. It's 8% of the sale price. And that could be a significant number.
Mhm.
So just keep that in mind. So a lot of sellers get to the closing table and are surprised when they get slapped with that fee.
Yep.
And they're surprised when nobody told them about it, when in reality it says it right here in the listing agreement.
Well, I just want to make sure I heard that correctly. 8% of the sales price of the property?
That's correct.
Wow, okay.
That could be a lot of money.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so make sure, so keep in mind, if they're living in the state, it's not an issue. If they're living out of the state, that's when it kicks in. Normally normally that would apply to a situation where where they've been renting it out, or it could be if the property's been vacant, and they're living out of state. But that's a lot of money, and a seller could be really pissed off at you if you haven't advised them of this, from the start. So make sure that if they're
We
living
own a property in Maryland.
Mhm. I'm sorry?
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought I was muted. I was just going over the scenario in my head.
Okay, yeah. Okay. So, all right, sounds good. So if there's no more questions, we'll move on. All right, the amount of payment for a non-resident individual is subject to adjustment on a recurring basis. Oh, we already covered that. All right, so this is the payment of that fee is due unless the seller certifies in writing under penalties of perjury that the seller is a resident of the state of Maryland, or is a resident entity of the state of Maryland, or number 2, presents to the clerk of the circuit court for a county or Maryland's Department of Assessment and Taxation a certificate issued by the comptroller to the state of Maryland stating that there is no tax due in connection with the sale or exchange of the property. Chances are they're not going to get that. A reduced amount of tax is due from the seller, and the reduced amount is collected by the clerk of the circuit court for a county or the Maryland Department of Assessments and Taxation before recording or filing. Chances are they're not going to get that either. If the seller intends to obtain a certificate from the comptroller's office, seller should immediately contact the comptroller at 1-800-Maryland-Taxes, obtaining the certificate, and it requires a minimum of 3 weeks. So if this is potentially an issue when you take this listing, you ought to have the seller contact this 1-800 number to find out if their scenario is going to require taxes to be withheld, and if so, how much those taxes are, and if they can get a certificate to be presented at the settlement table, then they can avoid the payment of the tax. But in order to get the payment in order to get that certificate, they will have to get they will have to make sure that whatever taxes are owed are paid in advance. It could very well be less than 8%. So it is to everybody's interest, if you're taking a new listing and the owner lives out of state, that they contact this 1-800-Maryland-Taxes phone number when you take the listing so that they can take care of this tax and minimize that 8%. It could be less if they call this 1-800 number. All right. It's basically what it is. All right. FIRPTA. Who can tell me what FIRPTA means? Anybody have any idea what FIRPTA means? So FIRPTA is a rule that is set up by the IRS, and it talks about capturing taxes, because every real estate transaction is reported to the IRS, right? So if there are taxes due because of the sale of the property, and the seller is a foreign person, meaning that they don't have a social security number, then the US government doesn't have a way to capture the taxes back from them if they are out of the country. So FIRPTA is a law that was enacted to make sure that the US government has a way to collect that So, and so the rules of FERPTA are defined in the section 1445 of the IRS Code of 1986. And so that's all of the terms of that. It gets very complicated and involved. But basically what has to happen is prior to settlement, the seller has to sign an affidavit stating that they are not a foreign person as is defined by IRS rules. We're not defining what a foreign person is in this situation. It's IRS rules that is defining that. So keep in mind that let's stay away from putting ourselves in that situation. If they are a foreign person and they do not have a social security number, then what will happen is the IRS will withhold from the proceeds of the sale a tax subject to liquidation upon the next filing of a tax return. Okay. And by virtue of signing that affidavit, they will be withholding that tax. If they sign an affidavit saying that if they are a foreign person, that's what it will be. If they are not a foreign person, then that whole scenario goes away. But keep in mind that the burden for performing on that is on the shoulders of the buyer by the IRS code. Now, that doesn't make sense to us in the real estate industry, because why should the seller's debt of taxes be placed on the burden of the buyer? And the reason for that, the way that the IRS sees it, is that they need to have somebody to go after. And the only way that they can go after anybody is by putting the burden on the buyer. So what our title attorneys do is they produce these affidavits. The seller signs off on it, indicating that they are or are not a foreign person. But make sure that you understand that there is ultimately an obligation to satisfy this in the end. And if you have further questions on that, we'll have further trainings on FERPTA in the near future with our title professionals from Universal Title. All right, paragraph 30, FHA loan notice. If the current loan on the property is insured by the FHA, the loan shall be paid in full at settlement in accordance with FHA rules and regulations. Well, that goes for any loan. So any loan that's on the property will get paid by the seller at the settlement table, and the proceeds of that will pay it off. And then anything that's left over goes to taxes will be taken out first, then the loan, and then anything that's left over will go back to the seller. Paragraph 31, this agreement is binding upon the parties here too. And we've got to really enforce with our sellers that these are legally binding documents. And when we get into an agreement with a buyer, this is a legally binding document with obligations and liabilities. And if we don't do what the contract says, when the contract says we have to do it, then we could be held in violation of the contract and in default, and we could have legal consequences. So it's important that the sellers understand this, that they can't just willy-nilly decide to change their mind. Once they've signed these documents, there's an obligation to perform. So make sure that everybody understands that it cannot be changed. Everything is in writing. It cannot be changed unless if it's in writing, and that there are no other existing agreements or conditions other than that set forth herein. So if if they sign a listing agreement with you, what they're telling you here is that they are not in another agreement. They're telling you that they are not in another listing agreement with some other listing company at the same time, or anything, or that any other agreements that they have are not going to cause a conflict with your listing agreement.
A quick question as well. So like when worst case scenario, buyer sells a seller for not fulfilling the contract, it could be monetary, but it also could be like they could be just forced to fulfill the contractual agreements, correct?
In theory, yes.
Okay.
In practice, Usually what ends up happening is that it ends up being some kind of exchange of money. But
Okay.
in some cases, it could be where the specific performance is exercised and a party is forced to actually transfer the ownership of the property. Yes. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Perfect. Thank you.
All right. So paragraph 32, we are including specific addenda as attached to this contract. If you do not check the boxes here, you could be causing a situation that could cause some gray area, a potential argument as to whether or not some conditions are going to be attached to this offer. So if we're going to be in dual agency, you've provided consent for dual agency. If one of the parties to the contract is a licensee, a salesperson or a broker, we've got to disclose that. If there's a federal lead-based paint disclosure that's required, we've got to disclose that also. If there are financial conditions, if there's a financial condition property disclosure, and that usually applies in the state in a condition where there's a condo or an HOA, we've got to include that also. If there's an inclusions and exclusions addendum, we've got to include that also. A lockbox addendum giving you authority to put a lockbox on, and the rules by which the lockbox is administered. The Maryland lead-based paint lead poisoning prevention program usually applies when there are rentals. That's always going to be included. The property disclosure statement, unless the property is exempt. So the exemptions occur when there's a foreclosed property or if there's an estate, because those entities typically won't know the answers to whether or not a property has material defects or not, right? So the estate executor may not know that there is, broken pipes or, or a leaky roof. So they are exempt. Just be aware of that. If there are other conditions and other addenda that you're attaching to the listing agreement, other terms and conditions, and we need to specify which ones those are. If the seller is a Maryland non-resident seller transferee, and then if there's going to be withholding tax, that addendum is going to be attached there. Remember, we talked about that just a few moments ago when we were talking about the transfer tax, the withholding tax. Now, after they file their next tax return and liquidate the taxation amount, that 8% that we talked about could very easily part of that could easily get refunded back to them. But in the meantime, when they're waiting for those proceeds to hit their bank account, that could hold them up. So make sure that they dial the 1-800 number that we mentioned earlier and let that, and at least they can get a better idea of what that taxation amount's going to be, pay it off in advance so that they can get the certificate and not have to worry about having to file later on. If there's a deferred water or front foot benefit, we should include that. And we should always, when a property is built before 1978, use the blue book and disclose that with your listing agreement, your blue lead-based paint booklet. That's what this book is. Protect your family from lead in your home. That's the blue book, the blue lead-based paint booklet. So that brings us to our brokerage. Here, we're going to put this here. You're typically going to leave the broker name here empty. We as agents are not authorized to sign this by the broker. The broker here is Brendan Green, and he is the only entity name that will be used to sign here normally. And as agents, we are not authorized to sign this. And that appears when after you've taken your listing and you have gotten the seller to sign it off here, and you've submitted the entire listing package to compliance, Melinda McNabb. Melinda will go ahead and put Brandon's signature here in the compliance process. And keep in mind, you have 2 calendar days to get this document back to Melinda in order for her to get this signature on here. If you do not get Brandon's signature on a listing agreement or on a contract, but listing agreement or a buyer agency agreement, you do not have a binding listing agreement. I'm going to repeat that because I want to make sure that you guys get this. Just because you have your seller sign this listing agreement does not mean that you have a valid binding listing agreement. It must include Brandon Green's signature here for it to be valid and binding. So you could be effectively putting this property on the market today with the seller's signature, and in reality, you're in violation of the law because you are now listing a property without having the broker sign off on it. It must have the broker's signature, and it must be the documents need to be then delivered back to the seller with all of those signatures in order for a fully ratified listing contract to be considered deemed complete and ratified, and now you're legal to go. Otherwise, you are working for free. So if you take a listing, get the seller's signature here, and don't get the buyer broker signature here, or the listing broker here, you're working for free. And the seller could skip out on their obligations to pay you, and you could be spending money marketing their property, all to get nothing at the end of the day. Does anybody have any questions on that? And that's the end of our class. Anybody have any general questions for me overall? Any topic whatsoever, broker related topics? You can answer, plug away, ask me any questions you like, and I'm happy to answer anything that you have for me. You name
I have
it.
one question a little unrelated to, well, it is related to the whole process, but when you submit all this, what's the difference between, sorry, because I'm brand new, title insurance and what the title company itself, like submitting, escrow and all that stuff?
I'm not quite sure what your question is.
So like the buyers are encouraged to buy, I've heard, title insurance that, well, the lender makes them buy, but they're also encouraged, I heard, to buy private title insurance. Is that from the same title company that's
Yes.
managing escrow? They
Yes.
buy that separate. Okay.
Yeah, that's at the same time. So the title company will work, the mortgage lender is going to require a mortgage title policy. Okay, that's, there's no way you can avoid that. You have to do that. If you want the money from the mortgage lender, they're going to require you to have the mortgage title insurance. If you now, I strongly personally do not. First of all, you should be telling your buyers that they really need title insurance, and they probably need an enhanced title insurance policy. There's an enhanced policy and there's a standard policy. That is for the buyer coverage, not the mortgage coverage title policy, but it's a buyer coverage for the policy. And if there's any kind of legal action that's taken against the title later on, then that buyer's policy will cover them for their expenses in order to fight that legal suit. So if there's any kind of claim, any kind of previous owner or anybody who claims to be part of an estate previously that had legal rights and claims to the property, all they have to do is notify the title company, and the title company will handle those claims. If there's any land disputes, related to the property, those things will also be paid by the title company. So that is all done at the same time prior to settlement.
Okay, so from the lender's perspective, their title insurance covers their end, and the buyer, when they purchase their own, covers their expenses.
Correct.
Okay, all right, that makes sense. Thank you.
And I personally will not allow my buyers to do the transaction without buying title insurance. If they don't want the buyer, if they don't want the title insurance, I have them sign a waiver of my liability that I've informed them of the risk that they're taking by not getting the title insurance policy.
Okay, is that something that, just out of curiosity, that like, does that happen where like a lien will appear, you know, a year after a buyer buys a property, and then that's something common, I guess?
All kinds of crazy issues can happen. And it
Okay.
doesn't happen often, but once in a while it does. And usually when an issue pops up like that, the legal costs for fighting that are extremely high. And they're it's extremely problematic. So it's not, title insurance is really not that expensive for the potential benefit that it gives you. It's a far safer cry to go ahead and just get the title insurance and not have to worry about it in the future, because it could really cost you a lot of money to fight any issues later on, especially if you're buying something from an estate or a foreclosure, anything that was recently into foreclosure, or if there's anything related to a tax sale or tax liens, anything like that could really, really be an issue, and you really need that title insurance policy.
Wow. Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Anybody else have any general questions? Open season for the broker here.
Now, you had this training that was specific to Maryland documents. Have you done, or are you going to do one for DC?
Oh, we have an entire library that is available. Hold on a second. Let me reshare let me reshare my screen here, and I will show you where all of the documents, all of these trainings are currently available. Glad you brought that up. So if you go to the welcome drive, the KWCP welcome drive, you see here this link here, you can see my screen, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
You see this link, kwcapitalproperties.com/welcome, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
If you go there, and if you go to the folder number 4, virtual education, and it brings you to this page here. And then you go down here to this document, KWCP contracts training on demand. This is all the classes that are taught by the brokers in the company, that contains all of the topics. And so it's set up by the jurisdiction, Maryland Realtors, GCAR, NVAR. And all of these topics are all covered here.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. And they're talking, so you name it, it's all talked about here. And we've got new ones that are being added all the time. And so, you know, and then at the bottom here, we've got some title attorney classes as well. The next title attorney class is going to be on April 13th, which is going to be Universal Title is going to be teaching a TOPA single family class. So we've got one TOPA class here that was a deep dive multifamily class. We're going to be having another one on April 13th. I believe it's at 11 a.m. And it's going to be covering the TOPA single family. And so the attorney classes, these are attorney taught classes down here, but the rest of these classes that are taught all on this thing are all available on demand 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. And this class we're experiencing today will be posted in this library probably within the next couple of days.
Awesome. Thank you.
Sure. My pleasure. Anybody else have any other questions? Anything at all?
Can you repeat where is it that you went? It was something welcome.
Yeah. Okay. So if you go here, kwcapitalproperties.com, you see that where my mouse is moving here?
Oh, okay. Yes.
Yeah. kwcapitalproperties.com/welcome. All right. Then you're going to go down here to the 4th folder, virtual training library. And then you're going to go here to the KWCP contracts training on demand library. And this is where all of those classes are posted. All of the lead brokers in the company teach these classes and post these right here. So this is today's class that we're just talking about right now. So in a couple of days, maybe even, I might even be able to post it up here today, later today. We're going to put the link to this class that we just did today right here.
Oh, okay. So these are the recordings, not the upcoming.
That's correct. These are the recordings. If you want to go to the upcoming classes, then what you're going to do here is you go to the same link. It's KW Capital Properties/events. Okay. And here, this is the calendar for the rest of March. So these are all the classes, all of the classes that are being held company-wide, whether it's in DC, Maryland, or Virginia. Be sure to click on the extra links here. So for example, for March 23rd, these are all the activities, all the classes that are being taught within the company on March 23rd. The next day, we move on, same thing. These are all the classes that are being taught in the company for those things. If we want to go look for the month, let's see what's going to happen in April. These are the events. Oops, where are we? Oh no, that's March. April. So these are the events that will be held in April. And so all you have to do is click on it, and it'll give you the link, the time, the date. That's how you can find the training classes. Anybody else have any other questions? Anything broker related? DC, Maryland, Virginia. Shoot, I'm
I
here
have a
for it.
question about FERPTA.
Yes.
I am actually meeting with someone later who lives in Thailand and has an investment property that he's selling. And what questions do I need to ask of the listing agents regarding the status? And how do I protect my buyer and knowing what they're getting into?
Well, the title company, that's going to be the title company is going to sort that out for you. So the conversation that we had today about FERPTA was a discussion that we have with the sellers when we're taking the listing. When you're the buyer, you're going to be relying on the title company to make sure that answer gets solved early on. So you will contact the title company and find out what the seller's status is with regard to FERPTA. So you're just going to ask the title company, what's the status, what's the FERPTA status, and what kind of protections is my buyer being given regarding FERPTA?
And that's going to be protected just for a certain period of time, or is that until the answer is satisfied?
So it's either a yes or a no question. So when you go to the title company, the title company will be able to tell you, yes, the seller is a foreign person, but as defined by IRS, or is not a foreign person. If they are a foreign person, then you will make sure that the title company will have the affidavit signed at the settlement table or before the settlement, and that the taxation amount is paid into it. So just basically ask the title company, are they on top of the FERPTA issue, or are they not on top of the FERPTA issue? Is the seller a foreign person, or are they not?
Okay.
If they are not a foreign person as defined by the IRS, you don't have to worry about it.
Mm-hmm.
So if all you have to do is ask the title company that, and then you can ask to see the evidence of the affidavit that the seller will sign at settlement.
Okay.
So you'll just want to verify that before settlement.
Okay. And that's not for any particular period of time. No,
it's just for settlement. It's just at the, that it's strictly at the time of settlement. Is the seller a foreign person, or are they not?
And in terms of the insurance that we were talking about,
Title insurance?
not the title insurance, but just the homeowner's insurance.
Yes.
How does the buyer know what that property's score is and whether or not he can even afford the insurance?
That's why it becomes, and we talk about this in the contracts class, in the GCAR contracts class and in the MR contracts class. And in the financing contingency paragraphs in the contract, what you will find is that there's a requirement that the seller make application and obtain an insurance policy for the new property within 5 days of ratification of the contract.
Okay.
So the buyer should be doing that, finding that new insurance policy within the first 5 days after ratifying the contract. And by contacting their insurance company, the insurance company will check the clue scores and
Gotcha.
determine what the clue is for the property and what the clue is for the new buyer. And then that will give them their dollar amounts that the policy is going to cost the buyer X. And then that will be figured in. So if X ends up being a lot more than the lender had estimated, then that's going to be known and obvious to you early in the process. And if the X amount is going to make the total monthly expenses of your buyer disqualify for the loan because those insurance rates are so high, it now puts them out of their debt to income ratios, then you're going to know that early enough, and you're going to be able to void the contract to protect the buyer's earnest money because you now have got a loan rejection.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's why it's important to do that very early in the process. A lot of people end up waiting at the end of the contract process to get the property insurance, and that's a big mistake.
And is the insurance company speaking to the lender the whole time, or is that something we're going to?
All your buyer has to do is get the policy.
Okay.
Lock in the policy and get the binder and get the information to that, and get the quote, and make sure that the lender has that document early in the process.
Okay.
Make sure that the lender has it early in the process. If you wait till the last minute, you may end up, a lot of times people end up doing is they may end up getting that quote maybe 3, 4, 5 days before settlement. And by then their financing contingency has already expired.
Right.
If your financing contingency has expired and you're now rejected, that could be a problem.
Right.
So discover that information early.
So clarification question regarding this. So is this something that typically the lender would kind of get the buyer to do? Or is this something that like us, the realtor, would say, okay, now that you just ratify, go ahead and get your quote.
Yeah.
And give it to the lender.
You need to do it yourself. You need to tell the buyer to do that yourself, okay? Because the lender is only going to ask for that information, maybe 3, 4, or 5 days before settlement. But you need to make sure that the buyer does that early, within the first 5 days, so that you have that information and you can give that information to the lender, because you want to know all of that information before your financing contingency expires. That's the key, getting that information in the hands of your lender before the financing contingency expires. Because if you need to void the contract because the property is no longer affordable because of that insurance rate, you want to be able to have that out.
Okay. I have another question. Is there a, I don't know if there's a checklist, or is there some sort of guidance for like new agents to know kind of like what are the steps, or what forms are needed, or kind of like this kinds of things, like make sure you do this and make sure you do that. I'm not sure I'm asking for too much, but.
No, that's okay. So were you in part of the class when we talked about this? Where you see my screen here now?
Yeah, I came in late, like at 10:40, sorry.
Okay. Yeah, so that's okay. We talked about this at the beginning of the class. And so when you're in command, and if you're not familiar with command yet, you'll need to get connected with the staff, the office staff, and the tech support team, the tech ambassadors, and they will get you connected up to speed with this stuff. All right. But once you get into command and you've got your account set up, and you have gone into you've established an opportunity, this is the opportunity page, and we are in the jurisdiction here. Let's say that we're in Prince George's County, Maryland. Then the checklist is right here. Okay. So this is the checklist of all the documents that you need for your listing agreement. Okay. Similarly, this is the checklist right here for Maryland buyer documents. Similarly, this is the checklist that you need for contract documents in Maryland. Okay, so this is all the list of stuff that you need, and all of that is available in your opportunities. In addition, that stuff is also available if you go to the welcome drive, as we talked about before. And let me just do this. So if we go to the welcome drive again, and we go to this time, if we go to paragraph folder 6, and then we go to we go to checklists here. All of the checklists are available for all the jurisdictions that we operate in. Okay, so here's the one for Prince George's County. And this document is the same one we just looked at a second ago. Okay, so so that's what we are able to do. So you're able to go to folder number 6, go to checklists, and whatever jurisdiction we're looking at, whether it's DC, Maryland, Virginia, any of those other jurisdictions, they're all available here.
Okay, so this seems like they're just the forms that are needed. I don't know if I'm asking for too much, but is there anything where it would tell you not just the forms, but sort of like these things that you just we talked about, like make sure make sure you ask your client to get this the insurance, the quote for the insurance, make sure. I mean, I don't know, like certain things that we shouldn't miss.
All of those topics are discussed in the class, in the broker classes that we're teaching. So for example, let me move this down here real quick. So in this checklist, right? So when we're talking about everything that's needed, and let's say that you were writing a Maryland contract, or if you're writing a GCAR contract in DC, right? So here, if we were to go to this particular one, and this class teaches us everything that we need to know about the GCAR sales contract. Okay, and I taught this particular class a while back, so you can watch the whole video, and we'll learn, and we'll teach you all about the contracts.
Oh, wow. Okay, great.
Okay, so all you have to do is go through all of these videos that talk about all of these different things. Pick your topic. If you're needing to get a buyer agency agreement, this video talks about the buyer agency agreement. If you're needing to get discussions on the jurisdictional addenda, or the condo addenda, or the disclosure brokerage relationships, the listing agreement in GCAR, Maryland leases, Virginia exclusive right to represent the buyer, on and on and on. We just go through all of these things, and we're adding new ones all the time. So that's how you would do that. So if you're a new licensee, I would connect with your productivity coach, work with your productivity coach, engage with them, and participate in all of their training classes. And at the same time, there's a checklist that they're going to give you, and they're going to require that you complete. So let's say that you're a DC licensee, for example, okay? If you're a DC licensee, you're going to need to complete the GCAR curriculum. So the GCAR curriculum is going to be this one here in the center. And you're going to need to view all of these classes that appear in the center column here. And you're going to need to go through all of these and learn from these videos. Okay. And you're going to need to go through all of these in the gold section and the blue section. You're going to need all of these. And it's advisable that you go through these other ones as well. Okay. So that's what you're going to need to do. And you're going to be doing this in conjunction with your productivity coaching. Then you're going to be learning all these topics here, and then that's going to teach you what you need to do. And then if you want to later on, you'll be able to tap in and get a mentor if you're interested, but you only get a mentor after you finish productivity coaching.
Okay, great.
Which office are you affiliated with, Martha?
With the Upper Northwest.
Okay, yeah. And so at Upper Northwest, the broker out of that office is Tim Phelps, and Tim Phelps has got a few. So Tim and I did a class back here on the GCAR residential sales contract. So you can see he and I did that class there. And again, he's got one here on Maryland Buyer Agency here as well. So.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Sure, my pleasure. Anybody else have any other questions?
Last question. How many days would you recommend, or does the company recommend to put as the contingency for radon inspection and for lead inspection? You may have gone over that, but I came on late to the class.
Yeah, we didn't cover that in this period, in this class. Typically for radon, what I like to do is, so in our market, it's, because it is a seller's market, we need to, really, if you're representing a buyer and it is a seller's market, you've got to make sure that your offer is attractive enough to a seller that the seller is going to want to take your offer, right?
Yeah.
So we're balancing the need to be attractive to the seller while still protecting the buyer's interests. If you're the buyer, now this is if you're the buyer's agent. And so generally speaking, if we were in a buyer's market, I would say make your deadlines as long as possible. But since you were in a seller's market, you kind of want to make those as short as possible, because if you put 10 days for example, as a home inspection contingency, that's going to be a lot of time. And a lot of sellers are not going to want to accept your offer, because that 10 days is 10 days that they are removing their property off of the market and waiting for your buyer to make that decision. So typically what I like to do is I may go ahead and put the home inspection contingency for 5 days. And then if I'm going to get a radon test, I might also make that I might put that as 7 days, because what we end up doing is, if we're going to have a radon and a home inspection, usually you'll have the home inspector will be the radon, the person who will install the radon units as well. So usually what I do is on the home inspection day, my inspector will install the radon detectors in place, and then 2 days later, they will retrieve those. Okay. So I usually like to put my home inspection for 5 days and my radon for 7 days. If it's if you're talking about,
okay, in that same vein, do you waive recordation and transfer taxes just because it's such a seller's market now, just to make the offer more Is that what people are doing now?
you could. That could be, but keep in mind, if you're going to be waiving the participation for transfer and recordation taxes like that, that's going to be added money that the buyer needs to come to the table with. So, if the buyer has the cash to do that, you can do that. That's one option.
I see. But they have to come. Okay, that's significant then.
Yeah, everything is all of these little moving parts contribute to what makes your offer more attractive than the next offer. So, everything that you can do to tweak that to make your offer better, more attractive to the seller than the other offer, is something that you can do. But certainly that's one of the things that you can do to make your offer more attractive.
Thank you.
Sure. All right, folks. Well, I think we've done a good job here with the class. And if anybody needs to reach me, feel free to reach me. Here, I'll go ahead and put my contact information real quick. It's D Bouchard. Oh shoot, I'm not typing. At BW Capital Properties.com. That's my email address, and my phone number is 202-309-2339. I'm the lead supervising broker for Capitol Hill, DuPont Circle, and the New Hyattsville office. Tim Phelps is the lead broker for Upper Northwest. Melanie Gamble is for Bethesda. Jackie Grenning is for Rockville. Lisa Langley is for Fairfax, and Tracy Miller is for Stafford. So feel free to reach out to us if you need help. I'm happy to help you. I am licensed in all 3 jurisdictions, and I'm happy to help you out. So good luck, and hopefully we'll see you in the business world.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.